Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the Bob Marshall Wilderness in northwestern Montana, during what was supposed to be a simple 3-day camping trip with my co-workers from the accounting firm. The idea had been Jennifer's. Jennifer Davis, our office manager, had been pushing for months about team bonding and getting away from the fluorescent-lit hell of our downtown Missoula office. "We need to reconnect with nature," she'd said, her enthusiasm infectious enough to convince even our most reluctant colleague, Thomas Rodriguez, to agree to the trip. The final group consisted of Jennifer, Thomas, Kevin King from our IT department, and myself. We'd chosen the Bob Marshall Wilderness because Kevin had insisted on somewhere truly remote. No cell towers, no Wi-Fi, no distractions, he'd said, adjusting his thick-rimmed glasses with the same precision he used to debug our server issues. Just us and the mountains. The irony of our IT guy wanting to disconnect wasn't lost on any of us. The plan was straightforward. Drive up to the Holland Lake trailhead, hike in about 8 miles to a backcountry site near the Chinese Wall, and spend 2 nights under the stars. Jennifer had done her research, printing out topographic maps and weather forecasts, while Thomas had volunteered to handle the food supplies. Kevin brought his extensive camping gear, and I contributed my father's old hunting rifle, just in case we encountered bears. The drive up Highway 83 should have been our first warning. The closer we got to Holland Lake, the more isolated the landscape became. Dense forests of lodgepole pine pressed against the narrow road like dark walls, and the few scattered cabins we passed looked abandoned, their windows black and empty. By the time we reached the trailhead parking area, a persistent drizzle had begun, and low clouds obscured the mountain peaks. "Perfect weather for a horror movie," Kevin joked as we shouldered our packs, but his laugh sounded forced in the oppressive silence of the forest. The trail started easily enough, winding through a mixed forest of Douglas fir and western larch. Jennifer, ever the organizer, had insisted we follow a strict hiking schedule, with regular water breaks and map checks. For the first few hours, everything went according to plan. We chatted about work gossip, complained about our boss's latest policy changes, and took photos of ourselves grinning against the wilderness backdrop. But as we climbed higher, following the trail toward Pyramid Pass, the forest began to change. The trees grew taller and closer together, their branches interlocking overhead to block out most of the gray sky. The undergrowth became thicker, more tangled, and strange patterns in the moss-covered bark caught our eyes. Spirals and symbols that looked almost deliberate, as if carved by something with long, thin fingers. "Native American markings," Jennifer suggested when Thomas pointed them out, but her voice carried an uncertainty that made us all uncomfortable. "More likely bear scratches," I said, though the marks were too precise, too symmetrical to be natural. We made our first camp at mile marker 6 in a small clearing beside an unnamed creek that wasn't on our maps. Kevin spent 20 minutes trying to get a GPS signal on his satellite device, cursing as the screen flickered between searching for satellites and signal lost. "Technology," Thomas muttered, unpacking his sleeping bag with deliberate movements. "This is why I prefer books." As darkness fell, we built our fire in the designated ring and settled in for what should have been a peaceful evening. Jennifer produced a bottle of wine she'd smuggled in her pack, and for a while, the alcohol and the dancing flames created a sense of camaraderie. We told stories, shared embarrassing office memories, and laughed at Kevin's increasingly elaborate theories about why his GPS wouldn't work. But the laughter felt hollow in the vast silence surrounding our small circle of light. Beyond the firelight, the forest pressed in like a living thing, full of rustling sounds and the crack of branches that could have been wind or something else entirely. Every few minutes, one of us would glance toward the tree line, straining to see into the impenetrable darkness. "Did you hear that?" Jennifer whispered around midnight, her hand instinctively reaching for the bear spray on her belt. We all listened. From somewhere deep in the forest came a sound like wind through dry leaves, but wrong somehow. Too rhythmic, too much like breathing. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, then stopped so abruptly that the silence afterward felt deafening. "Just wind," Kevin said, but he moved closer to the fire. We eventually retreated to our tents, but sleep came fitfully. Every sound seemed amplified. The zip of a sleeping bag, the rustle of someone turning over, the distant hoot of an owl that didn't sound quite right. I lay awake for hours, staring at the orange fabric of my tent ceiling and listening to the forest breathe around us. Morning brought no relief. We woke to find our fire completely extinguished, not even cold coals remaining, just a circle of gray ash that looked like it had been dead for days. More disturbing, our food cache, which we'd carefully hung between two trees to prevent bear encounters, was empty. Not torn open or damaged, just empty, the rope hanging slack with all our provisions gone. "Bears don't untie knots," Thomas said, his usually calm demeanor cracking as he examined the undamaged rope and carabiners. Jennifer checked and rechecked her maps, her finger tracing our planned route with increasing agitation. "We should be here," she said, pointing to a spot on the paper, "but none of these landmarks match up." Kevin's GPS remained useless, cycling endlessly through startup sequences without ever acquiring a signal. Even his backup compass seemed to spin randomly, the needle never settling on magnetic north. "We need to stick to the plan," Jennifer insisted, though her voice carried less conviction than usual. "Follow the trail, reach our second campsite, and we'll figure it out from there." But the trail we'd followed the day before seemed different now. Narrower, more overgrown, leading in directions that didn't match our memories or our maps. The blazes on the trees, the orange paint marks that supposedly indicated the official trail, appeared and disappeared seemingly at random. Sometimes we'd follow them for an hour only to find ourselves at a dead end in thick undergrowth. Other times we'd backtrack to find blazes we swore hadn't been there before. By afternoon, we were hopelessly lost. "This is impossible," Kevin said, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool mountain air. "Trails don't just disappear." We made camp early, in another unnamed clearing that none of us remembered seeing on any map. The mood was tense, conversation limited to practical matters. Water purification, food rationing, we had only the emergency supplies in our individual packs, and debating whether to attempt self-rescue or wait for help that might never come. As we gathered firewood before dark, Thomas volunteered to search the area beyond the clearing. "Maybe I can find the real trail," he said, shouldering his small day pack. "I'll just do a quick reconnaissance, follow that game path to the ridge and see if I can spot any landmarks." "Don't go far," Jennifer warned, "and be back before full dark." Thomas nodded and disappeared into the trees, his orange jacket visible for a few minutes before the forest swallowed him completely. He should have been back within an hour. 2 hours passed, then 3. We called his name until our voices were hoarse, but the forest seemed to absorb the sound, offering no echo, no response. As darkness fell, we built up our fire and waited, taking turns calling out and straining to hear any reply. At 2:17 a.m., I remember checking my watch obsessively, Thomas walked back into our camp. "Thank God," Jennifer breathed, jumping up from where she'd been dozing against a log. "We were so worried. Where were you?" Thomas stood at the edge of the firelight, still wearing his orange jacket, his day pack on his shoulders. He didn't respond immediately, just stared at us with an expression I couldn't quite read. His eyes seemed different. Wider than usual, unblinking, reflecting the firelight like an animal's. "Thomas," Kevin prompted. "Are you okay? You look pale." "I'm fine," Thomas said, and his voice was exactly right. Same tone, same slight New Mexico accent he'd never quite lost. But something in his posture was wrong. Too straight, too still, like someone concentrating very hard on how to stand. "Did you find the trail?" I asked. Thomas tilted his head slightly, considering the question longer than it should have taken. "No trail," he said finally. "Just trees. Many, many trees." Jennifer frowned. "Are you sure you're feeling all right? Maybe you should sit down, have some water." "I am fine," Thomas repeated with exactly the same inflection as before. He moved to his sleeping area with movements that were somehow too precise, too controlled. As he passed by the fire, I caught a glimpse of his face in the full light, and my blood went cold. Thomas was smiling. Not a normal smile, but a wide, fixed grin that never changed, never wavered, even as he spoke. It was the kind of smile that made every instinct in my body scream that something was fundamentally wrong. But I said nothing. What could I say? That my coworker was smiling too much? That his eyes blinked too infrequently? Jennifer and Kevin seemed to accept his return with relief, chatting about the next day's plans while Thomas sat motionless by the fire, that horrible smile never leaving his face. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, Thomas's behavior became more obviously wrong. He didn't eat breakfast, just sat staring at his granola bar while the rest of us forced down our meager rations. When we asked him questions, he responded after long pauses, and his answers often didn't quite match what we'd asked. "How's your ankle?" Jennifer inquired, referring to a slight twist he'd complained about the day before. Thomas looked at her for nearly 30 seconds before answering. "My ankle is functional." Kevin shot me a concerned look. "Thomas, buddy, are you feeling sick? Maybe you ate something bad, or got into some bad water?" "I am not sick," Thomas said with that same unnatural smile. "I am very well. I feel very satisfied." The word satisfied carried a weight that made my skin crawl, like he was tasting something delicious as he said it. We broke camp reluctantly, still hoping to find our way back to civilization. But our progress was even worse than the day before. Thomas, who had always been our strongest hiker, now moved with an odd, lurching gait that didn't match his previous sure-footed style. Worse, he kept stopping to stare into the forest, his head cocked at unnatural angles as if listening to sounds none of the rest of us could hear. "Maybe we should split up," he suggested during one of these pauses. "Cover more ground. I could take Jennifer and search the northern ridge while Michael and Kevin check the southern approach." "Absolutely not," Jennifer said firmly. "That's Survival 101. Never split the group." Thomas's smile widened, showing more teeth than seemed possible. "Of course. How silly of me." By afternoon, we were completely exhausted and no closer to finding our way out. We'd been walking in circles, passing the same distinctive lightning-struck pine tree for the third time. Morale was at rock bottom, and Kevin had started making dark jokes about becoming one of those missing hiker stories you read about in the paper. That's when Thomas offered to gather firewood. "There's a good stand of dead timber just beyond that outcrop," he said, pointing to a rocky formation about 200 yards from our impromptu rest stop. "I can have an armload back in 15 minutes." Before any of us could object, he was already walking away, moving with that same unsettling gait. But this time, as he reached the edge of the trees, I saw something that made my heart stop. Thomas's shadow was wrong. In the late afternoon sun, our shadows stretched long and dark across the forest floor. But Thomas's shadow seemed to move independently, writhing and shifting even when he stood still. And the shape was wrong. Too tall, too thin, with appendages that didn't match his human form. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Kevin. But when I looked again, Thomas had disappeared into the trees, and there was nothing to see but empty forest. "See what?" Kevin asked. Before I could answer, we heard Thomas scream. It wasn't a human scream. It was the sound of agony and terror torn from a throat that was trying to form words but could only produce animal noises. The scream went on, echoing through the forest from multiple directions as if the very trees were crying out in pain. Then, abruptly, silence. "Thomas!" Jennifer shouted, leaping to her feet. "Thomas!" We ran toward the sound, crashing through undergrowth and scrambling over fallen logs, but the forest seemed to shift around us, paths appearing and disappearing, trees moving when we weren't looking directly at them. What should have been a 200-yard run stretched on endlessly, and we never found the rocky outcrop he'd mentioned. After an hour of frantic searching, we called off the hunt. There was no sign of Thomas, no torn clothing, no blood, no footprints. He had simply vanished as completely as if he had never existed. We huddled together that night, too terrified to sleep, taking turns on watch and jumping at every sound. The forest around us seemed alive with movement, full of rustling and creaking and the soft sound of footsteps that always stopped when we tried to pinpoint their location. At 3:33 a.m., Thomas walked back into our camp. "Hello," he said pleasantly, still wearing that horrible smile. "I have returned." Jennifer broke down sobbing, relief and terror warring in her voice. "Oh God, Thomas, we thought you were dead. We heard you screaming. We searched everywhere. Where were you?" Thomas considered the question with that unnatural head tilt. "I was gathering wood," he said, but he carried no wood. His clothes were clean, unmarked by hours in the wilderness. There was no sign that he'd been anywhere or done anything. "You were gone for 6 hours," Kevin said, his voice shaking. "We heard you scream." "Did you?" Thomas asked, and something in his tone made it clear that this wasn't really a question but rather a statement of interest, as if he were making note of our auditory capabilities for future reference. That's when I noticed his eyes. In the firelight, they reflected light like an animal's, but more than that, they were the wrong color. Thomas had always had brown eyes, but these were pale yellow, almost white, with pupils that didn't contract in the light. "Thomas," I said carefully, "what happened out there?" He turned those alien eyes toward me, and his smile stretched even wider. "I met someone," he said, "someone very hungry, someone who has been waiting a long time for visitors." Jennifer made a small choking sound. Kevin edged closer to where we'd stacked our packs, probably thinking about the bear spray. "Who did you meet?" I asked, though every instinct told me I didn't want to know the answer. "A relative," Thomas said and giggled, a high, chittering sound that no human throat should have been able to produce. "Family. We had a very long conversation about needs, about hungers that must be satisfied." He stood up then, moving with that same too precise control, and I realized he was much taller than he should have been. Thomas had always been about my height, maybe 5'8", but the thing wearing his face now towered over us, its limbs stretched and elongated like someone had pulled him on a rack. "I'm very grateful for the introduction," the Thomas thing continued conversationally. "It's been so long since we've had proper guests. The few hikers who find their way here usually don't last long enough for a real conversation." Kevin made a break for his pack, probably going for the bear spray, but the Thomas thing moved faster than anything human could move. One moment it was standing by the fire, the next it was behind Kevin, its elongated arms wrapping around his chest like pale serpents. Now, it said in Thomas's voice, "that's not very polite. We're having such a nice chat." Kevin screamed, but the sound was cut off as those arms tightened. I heard bones crack, a wet, snapping sound like green branches breaking. Kevin's struggles grew weaker, then stopped entirely. When the Thomas thing released him, Kevin crumpled to the ground like a discarded doll, his head bent at an impossible angle. Jennifer was hyperventilating, making little mewling sounds of terror. I reached slowly for my father's rifle, trying not to attract attention, but the thing wearing Thomas's face turned those yellow eyes toward me and shook its head. "I wouldn't," it said pleasantly. "Iron and lead won't help you here. This is our place, our hunting ground. Has been for centuries, long before your people decided to draw lines on maps and call it wilderness." "What are you?" I whispered. "Hungry," it replied and began to change. The transformation was the most horrifying thing I've ever witnessed. Thomas's skin split along seams I hadn't noticed before, peeling back to reveal something underneath that was pale and glistening. His face elongated, the jaw unhinging to reveal rows of yellowed teeth like broken glass. His fingers stretched into claws, and his hair fell out in clumps to reveal a skull that was the wrong shape entirely. But the worst part was that throughout the entire transformation, it kept Thomas's voice. "Do you know what a Wendigo is, Michael?" it asked as its spine cracked and extended, adding several feet to its height. "Your people have such amusing names for us. Skinwalker, Forest Devil, Winter Hunger. But we prefer our own name, the ones who consume." Jennifer tried to run then, scrambling toward the tree line on her hands and knees. The Wendigo watched her with interest but made no move to follow. "Where does she think she's going?" it mused, flexing its new claws experimentally. "We control every path, every trail. The forest only goes where we allow it to go." I finally managed to grab my rifle, chambering around with hands that shook so badly I nearly dropped the weapon. The Wendigo laughed, a sound like wind through dead leaves. "Go ahead," it encouraged. "Shoot me, see what happens." I pulled the trigger. The bullet took its center mass, punching through what had been Thomas's chest with a spray of dark fluid that wasn't quite blood. The Wendigo looked down at the wound with mild curiosity, then back at me. "Interesting," it said. That actually stung a little. The wound began to close, the torn flesh knitting itself back together like time-lapse footage of healing. Within seconds, there was no sign that I'd shot it at all. "Iron might slow us down," the Wendigo continued conversationally. "But bullets? No, those are just an annoyance. Now silver, that would be unpleasant. Or fire. We've always had an uncomfortable relationship with fire." I looked at our campfire, then back at the monster. It followed my gaze and shook its head. "Too small," it said. "You'd need something much bigger to do any real damage. A forest fire, perhaps, but that seems excessive, don't you think?" From somewhere in the darkness beyond our camp, I heard Jennifer scream. The sound echoed strangely, coming from multiple directions at once as if she were being passed between several unseen things. "My family is introducing themselves," the Wendigo explained helpfully. "They've been so patient, waiting their turn. But don't worry, we'll save some for last. You look particularly nourishing." I backed away slowly, keeping the rifle trained on it even though I knew it was useless. My mind raced, trying to remember everything I'd ever read or heard about creatures like this. "Fire," it had said. Fire was the key. The Wendigo seemed to read my thoughts. "Oh yes," it said. "Burn us thoroughly enough and we'll stay dead. For a while, anyway. But as you can see, your little campfire won't be sufficient. You'd need something much more substantial." That's when I remembered Kevin's pack. Our IT guy was obsessively prepared for everything, including emergency situations. He'd shown us his gear the first day, including a military surplus magnesium flare that he claimed could burn hot enough to melt steel. I dove for Kevin's pack, unzipping compartments frantically while the Wendigo watched with amusement. "Clever," it commented, "very resourceful. But you're thinking too small, Michael. Even if you manage to hurt one of us, there are so many more. We've been feeding in these woods for generations, growing stronger, multiplying. Every lost hiker, every missing hunter, they all become part of our family eventually." My fingers found the flare, a heavy cylinder about the size of a road flare but with military markings. Kevin had explained how to use it. Pull the tab, point away from yourself, and prepare for temperatures hot enough to weld metal. "You can't kill us all," the Wendigo continued, now moving closer with slow, predatory steps. "And even if you could, the hunger would just find new hosts. It always does. This wilderness is ours, Michael. It has been since long before your species learned to make tools." Jennifer's screaming had stopped, and in the sudden silence I could hear other sounds, wet, tearing noises that I tried not to think about. The Wendigo cocked its elongated head, listening with obvious pleasure. "Ah," it sighed. "They're being gentle with her. That's kind. She'll last longer that way." I pulled the tab on the flare. The magnesium ignited with a brilliant white light that turned night into day, casting harsh shadows and making the Wendigo shriek in what might have been pain or simply surprise. The thing that had been Thomas staggered backward, raising its arms to shield its face from the blazing light. But I wasn't aiming for the Wendigo. Instead, I threw the flare into the pile of dead wood we'd gathered for our fire, then grabbed Kevin's pack and ran. Behind me, I heard the dry timber catch with a whoosh that shook the forest. The magnesium flare burned at over 3,000 degrees, hot enough to ignite even green wood, and our campsite exploded into an inferno that lit up the entire mountainside. The Wendigo's screams changed pitch, becoming something that hurt to hear, a sound like breaking glass and tearing metal. I didn't look back, just ran blindly through the forest, crashing through undergrowth and scrambling over fallen logs while the fire spread behind me. I ran until my lungs felt like they were going to burst, then kept running. Branches tore at my clothes and face, roots caught my feet, and several times I fell headlong into the darkness. But I kept moving, driven by the terrible sounds echoing through the burning forest behind me. When I finally stopped, hours later I found myself standing in the parking lot at Holland Lake Trailhead. My car was exactly where I'd left it 3 days earlier, the keys still in my pocket. According to my watch, it was 4:47 a.m., and the eastern sky was just beginning to show the first hint of dawn. I looked back toward the mountains and saw a column of smoke rising from deep in the wilderness, black against the gray sky. In the distance, I could hear helicopters, Forest Service firefighters responding to the blaze that would eventually consume over 15,000 acres of the Bob Marshall Wilderness. The official report listed the cause as a campfire that got out of control due to high winds and dry conditions. 3 hikers were reported missing and presumed dead: Jennifer Davis, Thomas Rodriguez, and Kevin King from a Missoula accounting firm. The lone survivor, Michael Williams, was found in severe shock at the trailhead and claimed to remember nothing after the second day of the hike. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital, officially being treated for dehydration, exposure, and traumatic memory loss. The psychiatrist said it was common for trauma survivors to invent elaborate explanations for events too horrible to process normally. They prescribed medication and therapy and told my family that I would probably never remember what really happened to my friends. They were wrong about that last part. I remember everything. I remember the way Thomas's shadow moved independently. I remember the sound of Kevin's bones breaking. I remember the way the Wendigo's flesh knitted itself back together after I shot it. And I remember Jennifer's screams echoing through the darkness. But most of all, I remember what the Wendigo said about the hunger finding new hosts. Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself standing at my kitchen window, staring out at the darkness beyond my suburban neighborhood. I think about how easy it would be to walk out into that darkness, to keep walking until I reach the deep woods where no one ever goes. I think about the families camping in national parks, about solo hikers following remote trails, about all the people who disappear in the wilderness every year and are never found. And sometimes, when I'm thinking these thoughts, I realize I'm smiling. Just last week, I found myself researching camping gear online, looking at backpacks and sleeping bags and GPS devices. My search history shows pages about remote hiking trails, about the best times to visit isolated wilderness areas, about places where cell phones don't work and rescue teams might take days to respond to an emergency. I don't remember making those searches. This morning, I woke up to find mud on my shoes and pine needles in my hair, though I distinctly remember going to bed after watching television. My car's odometer shows 47 more miles than it should, and there's a faint smell of wood smoke clinging to my clothes. I'm writing this down because I need someone to know what really happened in the Bob Marshall Wilderness. I need someone to understand that the hunger didn't die in that fire, it just found a new host. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. It means I finally stopped fighting the urges and walked out into the darkness where I belong now. When they find my empty house and my abandoned car at some remote trailhead, they'll say I had a breakdown, that the trauma finally became too much to bear. But they'll be wrong. I'll be hunting. And if you're planning a camping trip, especially somewhere remote and isolated, you might want to reconsider. The wilderness isn't empty, no matter what the maps say. It's full of things that are always hungry, always waiting for the next group of hikers to lose their way and stumble into our territory. We've been expecting you. The hunger is patient, but it never stops growing, and there's always room for one more in the family. Always. My name is David Jones, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the Absaroka-Beartooth Wilderness, deep in the crazy mountains of Montana, during what was supposed to be a simple 3-day camping trip with my closest friends. The 5 of us had been planning this trip for months. There was Marcus, my college roommate who'd become a successful architect but never lost his love for the outdoors. Sarah, his girlfriend of 2 years, a nurse with nerves of steel and a laugh that could brighten any room. Tom, our group's eternal optimist and amateur photographer who documented everything. And Rachel, Tom's sister, a botanist who knew more about wilderness survival than the rest of us combined. We'd chosen the crazy mountains specifically because Rachel had heard about rare alpine flowers that bloomed briefly in late September. The area was remote enough that we'd likely have it to ourselves, yet accessible enough that none of us worried about the isolation. How naive we were. The drive to the trailhead near Big Timber took us through increasingly sparse civilization. Rolling hills gave way to dense pine forests, and eventually, the road became little more than a dirt track that wound through valleys where cell towers were just a memory. By the time we reached the Cottonwood Creek trailhead, the sun was already sinking behind the jagged peaks that gave the mountains their name. "Jesus, this place is beautiful," Tom said, immediately pulling out his camera to capture the way the dying light painted the mountains in shades of purple and gold, but also kind of intense. I knew what he meant. There was something about the wilderness here that felt different from other places we'd camped. The silence was too complete, broken only by the whisper of wind through pine needles. Even the usual sounds of wildlife seemed muted, as if the animals themselves were holding their breath. "Local Crow legend says these mountains are cursed," Rachel mentioned casually as we shouldered our packs. "They called them the Mountains of the Hungry Spirits." "Great bedtime story material," Marcus laughed, but I noticed his eyes scanning the tree line with a new wariness. We hiked about 2 miles before making camp in a small clearing beside Cottonwood Creek. The sound of running water should have been comforting, but somehow it only emphasized how alone we were. The creek's gurgling seemed to whisper secrets in a language none of us understood. Setting up camp took longer than usual. My tent stakes refused to bite into ground that felt too hard, then suddenly too soft. Tom's expensive new GPS unit kept losing signal, displaying impossible readings that put us everywhere from Canada to Mexico. Sarah's usually reliable camp stove wouldn't light properly, the flame flickering blue when it should have burned orange. "Weird," she muttered, adjusting the gas mixture for the 3rd time. "I just serviced this thing." Rachel was gathering firewood when she called out from the edge of the clearing. "Guys, come look at this." We found her standing before a massive pine tree, its bark scarred with deep gouges that formed a rough spiral around the trunk. The marks were too large and too precise to be from any animal I knew, extending from the base of the tree to well above my head. "Bear claws," Marcus suggested hopefully. Rachel shook her head, running her fingers along one of the gouges. "Wrong pattern. And see how they're burned black at the edges? This wasn't made by any animal." Tom raised his camera, but when he looked through the viewfinder, he lowered it immediately. "That's strange. The tree looks different through the lens. Darker somehow." We stood there for a long moment, none of us wanting to voice what we were all thinking. Finally, Sarah broke the uncomfortable silence. "Well, whatever made these marks is probably long gone. Let's get dinner started before it gets dark." But as we returned to camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The sensation crawled along my spine like cold fingers, making me glance repeatedly over my shoulder at the wall of pines that surrounded our small clearing. dinner was a subdued affair. The food tasted strange, not spoiled but wrong somehow, as if the very air was affecting the flavors. Even the water from our purified bottles had an odd metallic taste that made us all drink sparingly. As darkness fell, our fire seemed smaller than it should have been, casting dancing shadows that moved independently of the flames. The wood Rachel had gathered burned with an unusual smokiness, and occasionally we caught whiffs of something that smelled disturbingly like rotting meat. "So," Tom said, clearly trying to lighten the mood, "what's everyone's plan for tomorrow? I want to get some shots of those peaks at sunrise." "The rare orchids I'm looking for should be about 3 miles up the North Trail," Rachel replied, but her voice lacked its usual enthusiasm. "There's supposed to be a small meadow near Granite Peak where they grow." "Sounds perfect," Marcus said, pulling Sarah closer as a particularly cold breeze swept through the clearing. "We could make it a day hike, leave the heavy gear here." I was about to agree when we heard it, a sound that made every hair on my body stand on end. It started as a low howl, almost wolf-like, but as it continued, it became something else entirely. The sound rose and fell with an intelligence that was distinctly human, yet carried a hunger that was anything but. The howl seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the mountain faces until it was impossible to determine its source. It went on for nearly a full minute before trailing off into silence so complete that even the creek seemed to have stopped flowing. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered. "Wolf," Marcus said quickly, but his voice betrayed his uncertainty. Rachel was already shaking her head. "No wolf makes a sound like that. And did you notice? All the other forest sounds stopped when it started." She was right. The usual chorus of insects, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, even the wind. Everything had gone silent, as if the entire wilderness was holding its breath. "Maybe we should head back to the car," Tom suggested quietly. "In the dark?" Marcus shook his head. "That's more dangerous than staying put. We'll stick to our plan and head out first thing in the morning." But sleep was elusive that night. Every small sound seemed amplified. The zip of someone shifting in their sleeping bag, the soft whisper of nylon against nylon, the steady breathing of my friends, and underneath it all, I could swear I heard something else. Soft footsteps circling our camp, just beyond the reach of our dying firelight. I must have dozed eventually, because I was awakened by Sarah's scream. "Tom!" she was shouting. "Tom's gone!" I scrambled out of my tent to find the others already up, their flashlight beams cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Tom's tent was empty, his sleeping bag unzipped from the inside. "His boots are gone," Rachel said, her voice tight with worry. "And his camera." "Maybe he went to get sunrise shots," Marcus suggested, but we all knew Tom wouldn't have left without telling someone. "Tom," I called out, my voice echoing off the surrounding peaks. "Tom!" There was no answer except the gradual return of the forest sounds, birds beginning their dawn songs, the rustle of wind in the pines. It was as if nature was slowly coming back to life after holding its breath all night. "We need to search for him," Sarah said, already pulling on her hiking boots. "We stick together," Marcus insisted. "No one goes anywhere alone." We spent the next 2 hours combing the area around our camp, following every game trail and stream bed within a mile radius. Tom's footprints were easy to follow at first. They led north from camp toward the trail Rachel had mentioned. But about half a mile out, something strange happened. The prints simply stopped, not gradually, as if he'd found rock to walk on. They just ended in the middle of soft earth that should have held tracks perfectly. One moment there were clear boot prints in the dark soil, the next nothing but undisturbed ground. "This doesn't make sense," Rachel said, crouching to examine the spot where the tracks ended. "It's like he just vanished." "People don't just vanish," Marcus said firmly, but his voice carried less conviction than his words. We were preparing to expand our search when we heard him, Tom's voice calling from back toward camp. "Hey, where is everyone?" Relief flooded through me as we hurried back, but that relief curdled into something else the moment I saw him. Tom was standing beside the cold remains of our fire, his camera hanging around his neck, but something was wrong. He was smiling. Not the easy, natural grin we all knew, but a fixed expression that never wavered, never touched his eyes. When he turned to look at us, he blinked too slowly, and when he spoke, there was a flatness to his voice that made my skin crawl. "Where did you all go? I woke up and you were gone." "Tom, where the hell have you been?" Sarah demanded. "We've been looking for you for hours." "I was sleeping," he replied, that terrible smile never faltering. "I had the most wonderful dreams." "Your tent was empty," Rachel said slowly. "Your sleeping bag was unzipped." Tom's head tilted slightly like a bird trying to process an unfamiliar sound. "Was it? How strange. I don't remember getting up." "What's on your camera?" I asked, nodding toward the expensive DSLR that he always treated like a precious child. For just a moment, something flickered across Tom's face. Confusion? Fear? But then the smile returned, wider than before. "Pictures," he said simply. "Beautiful pictures." He began scrolling through the images on the camera's display, but held it at an angle where none of us could see. "Such beautiful pictures," he repeated, and for the first time since we'd found him, his smile seemed genuine. It was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. "Let me see," Sarah said, reaching for the camera. Tom pulled it back with startling speed, his movements too quick and too fluid for someone who'd just woken up. "No," he said, and his voice carried an authority that made us all step back involuntarily. "They're not ready yet." The rest of the morning passed in increasingly uncomfortable tension. Tom acted like Tom. He helped break down camp, discuss the day's hiking plans, even made a few jokes. But everything felt wrong. He moved too smoothly, spoke too carefully, and that smile never completely left his face. Most disturbing of all were the small things he got wrong. He called Sarah by her middle name, something none of us had ever done. He forgot that Marcus was lactose intolerant, despite Tom being the one who always reminded restaurants about dietary restrictions. When Rachel mentioned the orchids she wanted to find, Tom looked genuinely confused, as if he'd never heard of her research before. "Are you feeling okay?" Marcus asked as we started up the North Trail. "You seem different today." "I feel wonderful," Tom replied, and the way he said "wonderful" made it sound like he was tasting the word for the first time. "I feel like I've been sleeping my whole life, and I'm finally awake." The trail climbed steadily through dense pine forest, the trees growing larger and more ancient the higher we went. The air grew thinner and colder, and our breath began to mist despite the bright sunlight filtering through the canopy. But there was something else in the air too, a smell like meat left too long in the sun, faint but persistent. "Does anyone else smell that?" Sarah asked, wrinkling her nose. We all did, but nobody wanted to identify what it was. About an hour into the hike, we found the source. Just off the trail, partially hidden by fallen logs, were the remains of an elk, but it hadn't been killed by wolves or bears. The carcass had been arranged. Bones were stacked in neat piles, the skull placed ceremonially atop the rib cage. Strips of meat hung from nearby branches like grotesque decorations. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered, but it was Tom's reaction that made my blood run cold. He was photographing the scene, moving around it with the focused intensity of a professional crime scene photographer. And he was humming, a low, tuneless melody that seemed to harmonize with the wind through the pines. "Tom, what the hell are you doing?" I demanded. He looked up from his viewfinder, that impossible smile stretching wider. "Documenting," he said simply. "This is important. This is how it's supposed to be." "How what's supposed to be?" Rachel asked, but Tom had already turned back to his photography. We left him there and continued up the trail, though every instinct screamed that we shouldn't leave him alone. But we also couldn't stand to watch him photograph that obscene display any longer. "There's something wrong with him," Sarah said once we were out of earshot. "That's not Tom anymore." "Don't be ridiculous," Marcus replied, but his voice lacked conviction. He's probably just in shock from getting lost last night. People react to trauma in different ways. Trauma? Rachel stopped walking and turned to face us. What trauma? He says he was sleeping the whole time. And did you see how he looked at that thing back there? Like it was beautiful. I wanted to argue, to find a rational explanation for what we were all feeling. But deep down, I knew Rachel was right. Whatever had come back to camp this morning, it wasn't our friend. We reached the meadow Rachel had been seeking around noon. It was a small, circular clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a crystal-clear stream running along one edge. Under normal circumstances, it would have been breathtakingly beautiful. The rare orchids Rachel sought were there, tiny purple blooms that seemed to glow in the dappled sunlight. But beauty was the last thing on our minds as Tom emerged from the forest behind us. "Wonderful pictures," he announced, holding up his camera. "The best I've ever taken." This time, he showed us the display, and what we saw there made no sense. The photos were of us, taken from impossible angles, as if the photographer had been suspended in the air above our heads or hidden inside the trees themselves. But it wasn't just the angles that were wrong. In every image, our faces were distorted by expressions of terror that I didn't remember feeling. And in the background of each photo, barely visible among the trees, were shadows that looked disturbingly like human figures. "When did you take these?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Just now," Tom replied happily, "while we were walking. Don't we look wonderful when we're afraid?" That's when I noticed his eyes. They were still Tom's eyes. The same brown color, the same shape. But they reflected light differently now, like an animal's eyes caught in headlights. And when he blinked, it was too slow, like a lizard basking in the sun. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, backing away from Tom. "Now." "But we just got here," Tom protested, and his voice carried undertones that reminded me of the howl we'd heard the night before. "And I'm so hungry." That's when he opened his mouth wider than any human mouth should open, revealing rows of teeth that were too sharp and too numerous. The sound that emerged was that same impossible howl, but close enough now that we could feel it vibrating in our bones. We ran, crashing through the underbrush. Abandoning the trail in our panic, we fled down the mountainside as branches tore at our clothes and rocks sent us stumbling. Behind us, Tom's howl continued, joined now by other voices, a chorus of hungry sounds that seemed to come from every direction at once. "The car!" Marcus shouted. "We have to get to the car!" But the forest had changed around us. Paths that had been clear on the way up were now blocked by fallen trees. Landmarks we'd noted carefully were gone or altered. The GPS units on our phones spun wildly before dying entirely, screens going black despite full batteries. Worst of all, we could hear Tom following us. Not running, walking with measured, deliberate steps that somehow kept pace with our panicked flight. And he was calling to us, his voice carrying impossible distances through the trees. "Friends," he called, and the word was drawn out like a sigh. "Don't run from me. I want to show you such beautiful things." We stumbled into a small valley I didn't remember from our ascent, where the pine trees grew so thick that almost no sunlight reached the forest floor. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the ground squelched unpleasantly under our feet with each step. "There," Rachel gasped, pointing to a break in the trees ahead. "I think I can see the trail." But as we approached the opening, we realized it wasn't the trail at all. It was another clearing, this one filled with structures that made the arranged elk carcass look like a child's art project. Bones, human bones, had been woven together into complex geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. Skulls were stacked in careful pyramids, their empty sockets seeming to track our movement. And hanging from the trees like wind chimes were strings of finger bones that clicked together in the breeze with a sound like distant laughter. "Oh God," Sarah whispered. "Oh God, oh God, oh God." "This way," Marcus said, pulling her toward what looked like another gap in the trees. But we'd only taken a few steps when Tom emerged from the forest directly in front of us. He no longer looked entirely human. His limbs were too long now, his joints bending at angles that made my eyes water to follow. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and when he smiled, we could see that his teeth went all the way back to his throat. "I've been waiting for you," he said, and his voice was layered now. Tom's familiar tone underscored by something that sounded like grinding stone. "I've prepared such wonderful things to show you." "Tom," Sarah said, taking a step forward despite the obvious danger. "Tom, you're sick. Let us help you." "Sick?" The thing that had been Tom tilted its head, considering the word. "No, I'm finally healthy. I'm finally awake, and soon you will be too." It raised the camera, somehow still functional despite everything that had happened, and began taking pictures. But with each flash, something changed in the clearing around us. The bone structures seemed to shift and grow, reaching toward us like grasping fingers. The skulls turned to watch us more directly, and the sound of clicking finger bones grew louder and more rhythmic. "Stop it," Rachel shouted, but Tom just smiled wider. "Beautiful," he whispered. "You're all so beautiful when you're afraid. The fear makes you taste better." That's when Marcus made his move. With a roar of rage and terror, he charged at Tom, clearly intending to tackle him and give the rest of us a chance to escape. But Tom moved with inhuman speed, one elongated arm whipping out to catch Marcus around the throat. The sound Marcus made as those impossible fingers tightened was something I'll never forget. A wet, choking gasp that was cut off far too abruptly. When Tom released him, Marcus collapsed to the ground, his neck bent at an angle that left no doubt about his fate. Sarah screamed and dropped to her knees beside him, but there was nothing to be done. Marcus stared up at the canopy with eyes that would never see anything again. "Now he'll never leave," Tom said conversationally, and began photographing Marcus's corpse from multiple angles. "None of you will ever leave." That's when I noticed the other figures emerging from the forest around us. They moved like Tom moved, too fluid, too quick, with limbs that bent wrong and eyes that reflected light like mirrors. But unlike Tom, these things had been altered. For much longer. Their humanity was nearly gone, replaced by something that might once have been human, but had been reshaped by hunger and isolation into something else entirely. "Welcome," one of them said in a voice like wind through dry leaves. "Welcome to the family." "How many?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure I wanted an answer. "Dozens," Tom replied happily. "All the hikers who got lost over the years, all the campers who came here seeking solitude. We make sure they find what they're looking for." "The hunger changes you," another creature added. This one so far gone that I couldn't tell if it had once been male or female. "First in your dreams, then in your flesh. Soon you'll understand." Rachel grabbed my arm, her nails digging deep enough to draw blood. "Run," she whispered. "When I say run, go for that gap between the trees behind us." I wanted to tell her we couldn't leave Sarah, couldn't abandon Marcus's body to these things. But I also knew that staying meant becoming like them, and perhaps that was worse than death. "Now!" Rachel shouted, and we bolted for the tree line. Behind us, Tom's laughter echoed through the forest. Not his laughter, but something wearing his voice like an ill-fitting mask. The other creatures howled their hunger, and I could hear them crashing through the underbrush in pursuit. We ran blindly, branches whipping at our faces and roots trying to trip us with every step. The forest seemed to actively oppose our escape, paths appearing only to dead end against impassable walls of thorns, streams that had been ankle-deep becoming rushing torrents that knocked us off our feet. But somehow, impossibly, we kept ahead of our pursuers. Maybe they were toying with us, or maybe some last vestige of Tom's humanity was holding them back. I didn't know and didn't care. I just ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like rubber. We finally collapsed in a small grove of aspen trees, their white bark stark against the darkening sky. Somewhere during our flight, night had begun to fall, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. We have to keep moving," Rachel gasped. "They'll track us." "I can't," I admitted, my chest heaving. "I need just a minute." That's when we heard Sarah scream. The sound came from somewhere behind us, echoing off the mountain faces with a clarity that suggested she was much closer than I'd hoped. But it wasn't a scream of fear. It was something worse. It was a scream of recognition, of understanding something terrible. Then, abruptly, the screaming stopped. "She's gone," Rachel whispered, tears streaming down her face. "They're all gone." We huddled together in the growing darkness, listening to the sounds of the forest around us. But the normal night sounds, owls, insects, the rustle of small animals, were absent. Instead, we heard footsteps. Lots of footsteps, moving through the trees with patient, methodical searching. "David," Tom's voice called from somewhere in the darkness. "Rachel, why are you hiding from us? We just want to share what we've learned." "The hunger is beautiful," Sarah's voice added, and the casual way she spoke made it clear that whatever had been done to her was already complete. It makes everything so clear. "Please," Marcus's voice pleaded, though we both knew he was dead. "Please don't leave us alone out here." The voices continued throughout the night, our friends calling to us, pleading with us, promising us wonderful things if we would just come back to them. But underneath their familiar tones was that same grinding, inhuman sound we'd heard from Tom. As dawn approached, the voices finally faded, and we heard the creatures retreating deeper into the forest. But we knew they weren't gone, just waiting for the next night, the next opportunity. "We have to reach the car," Rachel said as the first gray light of dawn filtered through the aspens. But when we finally made our way back to where we'd parked, we found only an empty clearing. The car was gone, along with any evidence that we'd ever been there. The dirt road we'd driven in on was overgrown with vegetation, as if it hadn't been used in years. "This is impossible," I said, though I was getting tired of saying that word. "The hunger changes everything," Rachel replied quietly. "Not just the people, the place itself." We tried to follow the overgrown road, hoping it would lead us back to civilization. But after hours of walking, we found ourselves back at the same clearing, approaching from a different direction entirely. The forest had somehow folded in on itself, trapping us in an endless loop. That's when I saw them, Tom, Sarah, and Marcus, standing at the edge of the trees. They looked almost normal in the daylight, except for their eyes and the way they moved. And they were smiling those terrible, hungry smiles. "You can't leave," Tom said, raising his camera. "No one ever leaves. But that's okay. You don't want to leave anymore, do you?" And the horrible truth was, part of me didn't. The hunger was starting to grow in my belly, and with it came a strange sense of belonging. This place, these creatures, they were becoming familiar, comfortable even. "Fight it," Rachel whispered, but her voice was growing weaker. I looked at her and saw that her eyes were beginning to take on that same reflective quality I'd noticed in Tom. The change was starting in her too. "Why fight it?" Marcus asked reasonably. "We're all together now. We're all family." "Forever," Sarah added and began photographing us with a camera that had appeared in her hands. I felt my resistance crumbling, felt the hunger growing stronger with each passing moment. Soon, I knew I would be like them, changed, hungry, eternally searching for new visitors to the crazy mountains. But not yet. Not quite yet. I still have enough of myself left to write this account, to warn others who might think of visiting this cursed place. My phone found just enough signal to upload this story to my cloud storage before dying completely. Maybe someone will find it. Maybe they'll understand the warning. The Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness is not what it appears to be. The crazy mountains earned their name for a reason. The hunger that lives here is patient and clever, and it always gets what it wants in the end. Don't come looking for us. We're not lost. We're exactly where we belong now. And we're so very, very hungry. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the Cabinet Mountains wilderness of northwest Montana, near the Idaho border in October of last year. The four of us worked together at a data analytics firm in Missoula: myself, David Jones, Kevin King, and Brandon Edwards. We'd been talking about taking a guy's trip for months, something to break the monotony of spreadsheets and quarterly reports. David suggested the Cabinet Mountains, claiming his grandfather had told him stories about pristine fishing spots deep in the wilderness where few people ventured. The area was known for its dense forests of western larch and Douglas fir, brutal terrain, and the kind of isolation that either cleared your head or drove you mad. "It'll be perfect," David had said, his pale blue eyes lighting up with an enthusiasm I rarely saw at the office. My grandfather marked some spots on an old Forest Service map, said the trout there were the size of baseball bats. Kevin, our resident outdoorsman, had been skeptical. At 45, he was the oldest among us, a former construction worker who'd transitioned to data analysis after a back injury. He knew the mountains better than any of us. "The Cabinet Wilderness isn't a joke, Mike. That's grizzly country, and the weather can turn deadly without warning." But Brandon, always the optimist at 28, had convinced us. "Come on, man. We've been talking about this for 6 months. What's the worst that could happen?" Those words would echo in my mind for weeks afterward. We drove up on a Friday afternoon in mid-October, taking Highway 2 west from Missoula toward the small town of Trout Creek. The aspens were past their peak, their golden leaves carpeting the forest floor like discarded coins. David navigated using his grandfather's hand-drawn map, leading us down increasingly narrow forest roads until we reached a trailhead that wasn't marked on any official maps. "You sure about this?" Kevin asked, shouldering his massive hiking pack. His weathered face showed genuine concern as he studied the dense tree line ahead of us. "Trust me," David replied, but something in his voice seemed different, sharper. My grandfather knew these mountains better than anyone. The hike to our campsite took 4 hours through terrain that grew progressively more challenging. Ancient Douglas firs towered above us, their branches so thick they blocked most of the afternoon sunlight. The air tasted of pine resin and something else, something metallic that I couldn't identify. Our boots crunched through layers of fallen leaves that released the sweet scent of decay with each step. Brandon chatted nervously as we climbed, talking about anything and everything. Work gossip, weekend plans, a new Netflix series he'd been binge-watching. But as the shadows lengthened, even he fell silent. The only sounds were our labored breathing, the creak of our packs, and something else, a low humming that seemed to come from the trees themselves. "You guys hear that?" I asked during one of our rest stops. Kevin cocked his head, listening. "Hear what?" "That humming sound. Like electrical lines, but deeper." David looked at me strangely. "There's no power lines out here, Mike. It's probably just the wind." But there was no wind. The air hung perfectly still, heavy with the promise of the storm that was forecast for later in the week. We reached the campsite just as the sun disappeared behind the mountain peaks. David had led us to a small clearing beside a creek that ran crystal clear over smooth river stones. It should have been beautiful, but something felt wrong. The silence was too complete. In 20 years of camping, I'd never been in a forest so devoid of wildlife sounds. No birds, no insects, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. "This is it," David announced, dropping his pack with visible relief. "My grandfather said this was the most beautiful spot in all of Montana." Kevin immediately began surveying the area with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years in the wilderness. "Good water source, flat ground, natural windbreak from those rocks," he noted, but his expression remained troubled. "But I don't like how exposed we are. And where are all the animals?" Brandon laughed, though it sounded forced. "Maybe they're just shy." As we set up camp, the temperature dropped rapidly. By the time we had our tents pitched and a fire going, our breath was visible in white puffs. The flames cast dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the firelight, creating shapes that reminded me uncomfortably of reaching hands. David had been unusually quiet during dinner, poking at his dehydrated chili with a distracted expression. When Kevin asked if he was feeling all right, David looked up with eyes that seemed somehow darker than they had that morning. "Just thinking about my grandfather's stories," he said. "He used to tell me about the old days, when native tribes would warn trappers away from certain areas. Said there were hungry spirits in these mountains that could take the shape of people you trusted." "Jesus, David," Brandon muttered, glancing nervously at the wall of darkness beyond our firelight. "Save the ghost stories for after we've had a few beers." But David continued as if Brandon hadn't spoken. "The Kootenai called them Wendigo, said they were people who'd resorted to cannibalism during the harsh winters, and the act transformed them into something else, something that could never be satisfied." Kevin poked the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the starless sky. "Your grandfather sounds like he had quite an imagination." "Maybe," David replied, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. That night, I lay in my sleeping bag listening to sounds that had no business existing in an empty forest. Footsteps circling our camp, the soft whisper of something large moving through the underbrush. At one point, I could have sworn I heard breathing just outside my tent wall, slow and deliberate, like someone sleeping, standing up. I unzipped my tent flap quietly and peered out. The fire had burned down to glowing embers and the darkness beyond was absolute. But there, just at the edge of the dying light, I saw a pale shape that might have been a face watching us. "David?" I whispered. "That you!" The shape melted back into the darkness without a sound. I woke to the sound of Kevin's voice raised in confusion. "What the hell happened to our food?" Sunlight was filtering through the trees as I emerged from my tent. Kevin stood beside our makeshift camp kitchen, holding an empty bear canister. The metal container was designed to be impenetrable to even the most determined grizzly, yet it hung open like a broken jaw. "Bears?" Brandon suggested hopefully. Kevin shook his head grimly. "No claw marks, no tracks, and look at this." He pointed to our cooking pot, which sat exactly where we'd left it, but the metal was covered in a black substance that looked like tar. When I knelt to examine it closer, the smell hit me, rotting meat mixed with something sharper like ammonia. "That's impossible," I said. "We cleaned everything last night." David emerged from his tent last, stretching and yawning as if he'd slept perfectly. "Morning, guys. Sleep well?" Something about his casual tone bothered me. We'd just discovered that our food supply had been mysteriously destroyed, yet he seemed completely unconcerned. "Did you hear anything last night?" Kevin asked him. David shrugged. "Dead to the world." "Why?" Kevin explained about the food while David listened with what appeared to be polite interest. But I noticed he never actually looked at the ruined bear canister. His eyes kept drifting to the tree line, as if he was watching for something. "Well," David said finally, "good thing I brought backup supplies." He returned to his tent and emerged with a duffel bag I hadn't seen him pack. Inside were enough provisions for several more days. Freeze-dried meals, energy bars, even fresh jerky that should have spoiled by now but looked and smelled perfectly preserved. "When did you pack this?" Brandon asked suspiciously. "Last-minute addition," David replied smoothly. "My grandfather always said to overpack in the wilderness. You never know what might happen." The way he said it sent ice through my veins. It was as if he'd been expecting our food to disappear. We spent the morning fishing the stream David had promised, but the water was empty of life. No trout, no minnows, not even insects skimming the surface. The creek ran clear and cold, but it felt dead. Kevin tried several different lures and spots without success. "Your grandfather's fishing holes don't seem to be producing," he noted dryly. David's response was barely audible. "Maybe they're just sleeping." By afternoon, a thick mist had rolled in from the mountains, reducing visibility to barely 20 feet. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and the air became so humid it felt like breathing through wet cloth. We huddled around the fire, trying to stay warm while the fog pressed against us like something alive. That's when Brandon's watch stopped working. "Son of a bitch," he muttered, tapping the face of his expensive digital watch. Thing cost me $400 and now it's showing midnight. I checked my own watch. Also midnight. Kevin's analog watch had stopped entirely, its hands frozen at 12 EOS. Only David still had a working timepiece, an old mechanical watch that he claimed had belonged to his grandfather. According to his watch, it was just past 2 o'clock, but the light filtering through the mist suggested either early morning or late afternoon. It was impossible to tell which. "Time moves differently in the mountains," David said quietly. "My grandfather taught me that." "Time doesn't move differently anywhere," Kevin snapped, his patience finally fraying. "Something's interfering with our electronics. Solar flares, maybe, or magnetic anomalies." David just smiled that unsettling smile. "If you say so." The fog grew thicker as the day progressed, or at least as David's watch indicated time was passing. Sound became muffled and distorted. Voices seemed to come from the wrong directions. At one point, I could have sworn I heard Brandon calling for help from deeper in the forest, but when I looked around, he was sitting right beside me. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" Brandon replied, but his own voice sounded different, flatter, like someone doing a poor impression of him. Kevin decided to gather firewood before full darkness fell, though determining when that might happen had become impossible in the thick mist. He disappeared into the white wall surrounding our camp, and we could hear him moving around for several minutes before the sounds faded entirely. We waited. David's watch showed 30 minutes had passed, then an hour. There was no sign of Kevin returning. "Maybe we should look for him," Brandon suggested, but his tone was strangely indifferent, as if he was reading lines from a script. "He'll find his way back," David said confidently. "My grandfather always said the mountains provide for those who understand them." Another hour passed according to David's watch. The mist had grown so dense I could barely see my own hands. The fire had burned down to nothing despite the fact that we'd fed it regularly, and the cold was becoming unbearable. That's when we heard Kevin calling from multiple directions at once. "Help me," his voice echoed from the north. "I'm lost." "Over here," came another call from the south. "I can't find the camp." "Something's wrong," from the east. "Something's following me." Brandon stood up abruptly, but his movements seemed mechanical, puppet-like. "I should help him," he announced in that same flat tone. "No," I said quickly, grabbing his arm. "Something's not right. Kevin wouldn't call from 3 different directions." But Brandon pulled away from me with surprising strength. "I have to help," he repeated and walked into the mist before I could stop him. His footsteps faded within seconds, leaving me alone with David. I turned to confront him, but the words died in my throat. In the dim light of our dying fire, David's face had changed. His features were sharper, more angular. His eyes reflected the firelight like an animal's, and when he smiled, his teeth seemed longer than they should be. "Just you and me now, Mike," he said, and his voice carried harmonics that made my bones ache. "Where are they?" I demanded, backing away from him. "What did you do with Kevin and Brandon?" David tilted his head with predatory curiosity. "They're exactly where they need to be, where they chose to be." "That's not an answer, isn't it?" He stood slowly, and I realized he was taller than he had been that morning. Not by much, but enough to notice. "You know, my grandfather told me stories about men who came to the mountains looking for something they'd lost. Usually, they found it. But finding isn't the same as keeping." I fumbled for my phone, hoping to call for help, but the screen remained black despite having a full charge that morning. David laughed, a sound like ice cracking under pressure. "Technology doesn't work well here," he explained. "The old spirits don't approve of modern conveniences." "You're insane." "Am I?" He took a step closer, and in the firelight I could see that his skin had taken on a waxy, translucent quality. Veins showed dark beneath the surface like cracks in ice. Or am I just more honest about what we all are underneath? I ran. The mist swallowed me immediately. reducing the world to a sphere of gray nothingness extending maybe 6 feet in any direction. I stumbled through the forest, crashing into trees, tripping over roots, with no idea which direction I was heading. Behind me, I could hear David following, not running, just walking with that same unhurried pace as if he knew exactly where I was going. His voice drifted through the fog, coming from everywhere and nowhere. "You can't leave, Mike. None of us can. My grandfather understood that. This place takes what it needs." I kept running until my lungs burned and my legs trembled with exhaustion. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath, I found myself in another small clearing. But this one was different. Scattered around the open space were remnants of old campsites, rotted tent poles, rusted cooking gear, personal belongings that looked like they'd been abandoned for years. And bones. Lots of bones. Some were clearly animal remains, but others were unmistakably human. Femurs and rib cages picked clean and weathered white, skulls grinning eyelessly from beneath layers of fallen leaves. All of them showed signs of being gnawed, cracked open to access the marrow inside. I was examining one of the skulls when I heard footsteps behind me. "Kevin," I called hopefully, turning around. It was Kevin. But it wasn't. The thing that had Kevin's face and Kevin's clothes stood at the edge of the clearing, watching me with eyes that held no recognition. Its skin had the same waxy quality I'd noticed in David, and when it opened its mouth to speak, the voice that emerged was all wrong, too deep, with too many teeth clicking together. "Mike," it said, "you found the old camp. My grandfather's grandfather used to come here, before the hunger took him. You're not Kevin." My voice cracked with fear. "I'm exactly Kevin. I have all his memories, all his experiences. I know about his ex-wife Sarah and his back injury, and how he secretly hopes his son will call him someday." It smiled with Kevin's mouth, but the expression was alien. "I just understand things better now." "Where is he? Where's the real Kevin?" The thing that wore Kevin's face gestured to the bones scattered around the clearing. "He's everywhere, just like Brandon will be, just like you will be." And David? David was never David. David's grandfather brought him here 60 years ago when he was just a boy. The hunger took him then, but it let him keep the shape, keep the memories. It needed someone who could bring others. I felt my sanity starting to fray around the edges. "That's impossible. We've worked together for 3 years." "Have you?" The not Kevin tilted its head. "Or have you just been waiting for the right time to come here? Doesn't it feel familiar, Mike? This place? This clearing?" And God help me, it did. The arrangement of the trees, the slope of the land, the way the mist moved. I'd dreamed about this place for months without understanding why. "You've been calling us here," I whispered. "We've been calling you here," it corrected. "All of us. The hunger is patient, but it's also lonely. It needs family." I heard more footsteps approaching through the mist. David emerged from one direction, moving with that same predatory grace. From another direction came Brandon, or what had been Brandon. His transformation was more advanced. His skin hung loose in places, as if he'd lost substantial weight very quickly. His eyes had sunk deep into their sockets, and his mouth had widened into something that could accommodate larger bites. "Welcome to the family," David said, his voice now carrying that same harmonic distortion I'd noticed earlier. "My grandfather is so excited to meet you." That's when I saw him, the real patriarch of this nightmare family. He emerged from the mist like something that had been dead for decades but refused to lie down. What remained of his human form was stretched and elongated, arms hanging to his knees, fingers ending in claws that had worn grooves in nearby tree trunks. His face was a death's head covered in parchment skin, with eyes that burned like dying coals. When he spoke, his voice was the sound of winter wind through bare branches. "I've been waiting so long for new blood. The old stories are true, boy. The hunger never dies. It only grows." They began to circle me, moving with coordinated precision that spoke of long practice. But as David stepped closer, his foot caught on something, a piece of rusted camping gear half buried in the leaves. He stumbled, and for just a moment, his concentration broke. That's when I saw his true face underneath the human mask. Something with too many joints, skin like moldy canvas, and a mouth full of needle teeth designed for stripping meat from bones. The sight of it broke whatever spell had been holding me paralyzed. I grabbed the nearest weapon I could find, a heavy piece of iron from one of the old campsites, and swung it at David's head with every ounce of strength I possessed. It connected with a wet crunch, and he dropped to the ground, black blood pooling beneath his skull. The others let out inhuman shrieks of rage and pain, as if they were all connected somehow. I didn't wait to see if David would get back up. I ran into the mist, clutching the iron bar and praying I could find my way out of this nightmare. The fog seemed to part before me as I ran, as if David's injury had weakened whatever force was maintaining it. I could see stars appearing overhead, and in their light I spotted a faint trail leading downhill. I followed it desperately, expecting at any moment to feel claws raking across my back. I ran for what felt like hours until my legs gave out and I collapsed beside a stream I hoped was the same one that ran past our original campsite. My lungs felt like they were full of broken glass, and my heart hammered so hard I thought it might burst. But I was alone. No sounds of pursuit, no whispers in the dark. Just the normal night sounds of a forest that was actually alive. Owls calling, insects buzzing, small animals moving through the underbrush. I followed the stream downhill until I reached the forest road where we'd parked. Our vehicle was still there, keys in the ignition exactly where Kevin had left them. I drove straight to the Trout Creek police station and tried to explain what had happened. They organized a search party, of course. 3 missing campers was serious business, even if the 4th member of the group was clearly suffering from exposure and exhaustion. They found our campsite easily enough. The mist had lifted completely, revealing the clearing beside the crystal-clear stream. But there was no sign that anyone else had ever been there. No other tents, no personal belongings, no evidence of the struggle I described. The searchers did find the bone field I'd stumbled across, but according to the forensic team, those remains were decades old. Probably trappers and hunters who'd gotten lost in bad weather over the years. David, Kevin, and Brandon were listed as missing persons. Their families organized their own search efforts. Brandon's sister even hired a private investigator. But none of them were ever found. The official report concluded that they'd gotten separated in the fog and either fell into ravines or succumbed to exposure. My story about inhuman creatures and possessed friends was attributed to hypothermia-induced hallucinations. The detective who interviewed me was sympathetic but firm. The mountains could play tricks on a man's mind, especially when he was scared and alone. I went back to work after a few weeks of medical leave. They gave me a grief counselor and understanding looks. My co-workers sent flowers and offered their condolences. Everyone agreed it was a terrible tragedy. But sometimes, late at night when I'm working overtime at the office, I'll get a phone call from a number I don't recognize. When I answer, I hear familiar voices: David, Kevin, Brandon, asking when I'm coming back to the mountains, telling me how much they miss me, describing the wonderful family I could have if I just gave them another chance. Last week, David's replacement started at the company. Young guy, enthusiastic about the outdoors, eager to make friends with his new co-workers. He's been talking about organizing a camping trip to celebrate his first month on the job. He's got pale blue eyes and an old map that belonged to his grandfather. He says he knows some pristine fishing spots deep in the Cabinet Mountains where few people venture. I've been thinking about taking some vacation time, maybe visiting my sister in Florida, somewhere warm, somewhere far from the mountains and their patient hunger, because I know they're still waiting for me, all of them. And every night the craving grows a little stronger, not for food, but for the family I almost joined, for the acceptance I felt in those final moments before I ran. The hunger is patient, but it's also persistent, and I'm starting to understand that it might be easier to stop fighting it than to spend the rest of my life running from what I meant to become. My grandfather always said the mountains provide for those who understand them. Wait, I don't have a grandfather. I've never had a grandfather. But I remember him so clearly now. His weathered face, his stories about the old spirits, his warnings about the hungry things that live in the high places. I remember the map he drew, the fishing spots he marked, the way he smiled when he told me it was time to bring new friends to meet the family. The transformation doesn't happen all at once, I realize. It starts with memories that aren't yours, thoughts that feel foreign but familiar. Soon, I'll start making suggestions to my coworkers about taking a trip to the mountains. I'll have an old map and stories about my grandfather and pale blue eyes that light up when I talk about the wilderness, and somewhere in the Cabinet Mountains, they'll be waiting, all of them, ready to welcome another lost soul into their eternal family of hunger. The cycle continues. It always continues, because the mountains remember everything and they never let anything go. My name is Brian Wright, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Glacier Gulch, deep in the Cabinet Mountains of northwestern Montana, during what was supposed to be a simple 3-day hiking trip with my best friend Marcus. Marcus had been planning this trip for months, poring over topographical maps and researching the most isolated trails he could find. "We need to get away from everything, man," he'd said, his eyes gleaming with an intensity I'd never seen before. "No cell towers, no people, just us and the wilderness." I should have questioned that look then, but Marcus had always been the adventurous one between us. Where I preferred the safety of marked trails and established campsites, he craved the unknown, the untouched. The Cabinet Mountains wilderness area sprawled before us like a forgotten world as we parked at the trailhead near Lake Koocanusa. The nearest town, Libby, was over 40 miles away, and from there, civilization felt like another planet entirely. The October air bit at our exposed skin, carrying the metallic scent of approaching snow and something else, something that made my nostrils flare with unease. "You smell that?" I asked Marcus as we shouldered our packs. He paused, inhaling deeply. "Pine, mountain air, freedom," he said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. What else would there be? But there was something else. Something rotten and sweet, like meat left too long in the sun. I chalked it up to a dead deer somewhere in the underbrush and followed Marcus onto the narrow trail that would take us into the heart of Glacier Gulch. The first day passed without incident, though I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest seemed too quiet. No bird songs, no rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, as if the very air was absorbing sound. Marcus noticed it too, though he pretended not to. I caught him glancing over his shoulder more than once, his jaw tight with concentration. We made camp that evening beside a small creek that fed into the Kootenai River system. The water ran black in the fading light, and when I knelt to fill our bottles, I could have sworn I saw something pale moving beneath the surface, but when I looked again, there was nothing but stones and shadow. "Fire's not catching," Marcus called from behind me. I turned to see him crouched over a pile of kindling, striking match after match. Each flame would sputter and die before it could catch the dry wood, as if something was snuffing it out. The mountain air wasn't that cold, and there was barely a breeze. "Here, let me try," I said, taking the matches from him, but the same thing happened to me. Strike, flare, die. Strike, flare, die. Finally, on the 10th try, the kindling caught, but the flames burned a sickly green color that cast everything in an otherworldly light. "Probably something in the wood," Marcus muttered, but his voice carried no conviction. We ate dinner in relative silence, the strange fire crackling between us. Every time I looked up from my meal, I caught Marcus staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. When I'd meet his eyes, he'd smile and look away, but there was something hungry in that gaze that made my skin crawl. That night, I woke to the sound of breathing that wasn't my own. Marcus's sleeping bag lay empty beside me, unzipped from the inside. I could hear him somewhere in the darkness beyond our camp, but the breathing sounded wrong. Too deep, too rhythmic, like something much larger than a man. "Marcus," I whispered into the blackness. The breathing stopped. "Marcus, where are you?" Silence stretched for what felt like hours before I heard his voice, distant and hollow. "Just taking a leak, Brian. Go back to sleep." But the voice came from the opposite direction of where I'd heard the breathing, and there was something off about it, like someone doing a poor impression of my friend's voice. I lay rigid in my sleeping bag until dawn, listening to the sounds of the forest and trying to convince myself that isolation was just playing tricks on my mind. When morning came, Marcus was back in his sleeping bag, but he looked different, pale, thinner. When he smiled at me over our camp stove breakfast, I noticed his teeth seemed sharper than before. "Sleep well?" he asked, and his voice sounded normal again. "Like a rock," I lied. The second day's hike took us deeper into the gulch, following what Marcus claimed was an old hunting trail marked on his map. But when I looked at the map myself, I couldn't find the trail he was referring to. The paper showed only blank wilderness where we were supposedly walking. "Your map's different from mine," I said, showing him my copy. Marcus glanced at it briefly. "Old edition, mine's updated." But when he showed me his map, the paper looked aged and yellowed, with markings in a language I didn't recognize. The trail we were following was marked in what looked like dried blood. "Where did you get this?" I asked, but Marcus had already folded it away and was walking ahead. The forest around us grew thicker and darker as we climbed. The trees seemed to lean inward, blocking out more and more of the sky until we were walking through a green-tinged twilight even though it was mid-afternoon. The air grew colder with each step, and that rotting smell from the first day became stronger. We stopped for lunch beside what Marcus called Dead Horse Creek, though I couldn't find any creek by that name on my map. The water here ran rust red, and when I knelt to examine it more closely, I saw it wasn't water at all. It was blood, thick and congealed, flowing slowly downhill like some nightmare river. "We're not drinking from this," I said, backing away. Marcus was already filling his water bottle. "It's just mineral deposits," he said. "Iron oxide. Makes the water look red." He took a long drink, and when he lowered the bottle, his lips were stained crimson. That was when I knew something was seriously wrong with my best friend. I pretended to agree with him, but I didn't drink from the creek. Instead, I rationed the water I'd brought from our previous camp and tried to figure out how to get us both out of there safely. My GPS had stopped working that morning, showing only static where our location should be. My phone had no signal, of course, but more disturbing was that it was losing battery power at an impossible rate, dropping from full charge to 30% in just a few hours despite being turned off. That afternoon, Marcus began to change more noticeably. His movements became jerky and unnatural, like someone learning to walk in a body that didn't quite fit. He would stop mid-sentence and tilt his head, as if listening to voices I couldn't hear. When he thought I wasn't looking, I caught him gnawing on a piece of raw meat he'd pulled from his pack, meat that definitely hadn't been there when we started the trip. As the sun began to set on our second day, casting long shadows through the twisted trees, we made camp in a small clearing that felt wrong in every possible way. The ground was too soft, like walking on graves, and when I knelt to set up my tent, I felt something solid beneath the earth, something that felt distinctly like bones. The fire refused to light again, and this time no amount of coaxing could get it started. We would have to spend the night in complete darkness, in a place that felt more like a cemetery than a wilderness campsite. "I'm going to gather more firewood," Marcus announced as the last light faded from the sky. "I'll come with you," I said quickly. "No." His voice was sharp, commanding. "Stay here. Guard the camp." He disappeared into the trees before I could protest, leaving me alone in the suffocating darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, but when I clicked it on, the beam seemed to be absorbed by the blackness around me, illuminating only a few feet in any direction. That's when I heard the sounds. At first, it was just snapping twigs and rustling leaves, normal forest sounds. But then came something else, a wet, tearing noise, like fabric being ripped, followed by what sounded like someone eating, chewing, swallowing. My blood turned to ice as I realized the sounds were coming from the direction Marcus had gone. "Marcus!" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The eating sound stopped. "Marcus, are you okay?" I heard footsteps approaching through the trees, but they sounded wrong, too heavy, and there was a dragging sound with each step, like something being pulled along the ground. The shape that emerged from the darkness was tall and emaciated, with arms too long for its body and fingers that ended in black claws. Its face was a grotesque parody of human features, with sunken eyes that glowed with a sickly yellow light and a mouth full of needle-sharp teeth. Strips of flesh hung from its jaws, and its breath misted in the cold air like steam from a slaughterhouse. But the worst part, the part that made me bite down on my own tongue to keep from screaming, was that it was wearing Marcus's clothes. "Found some firewood," it said in Marcus's voice, holding up what I now realized was a human arm, torn off at the shoulder. I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, my flashlight beam dancing wildly as I stumbled over roots and rocks. Behind me, I could hear the thing that had been Marcus giving chase, moving through the forest with impossible speed and grace. Its laughter echoed through the trees, a sound like breaking glass and dying animals. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to stretch and compress around me, and more than once I found myself running past the same fallen log or distinctive rock formation, as if the forest itself was trapping me in an endless loop. My lungs burned and my legs shook with exhaustion, but the terror kept me moving. Finally, I stumbled into another clearing and collapsed behind a fallen tree, gasping for breath and trying to think. My flashlight was dying, the beam growing dimmer by the minute, and I knew that once it failed completely, I would be lost in the absolute darkness of the mountain night. That's when I heard Marcus's voice again, closer than before. "Brian, Brian, where are you? I'm hurt, man. I need help." The voice was perfect, exactly like my friend's voice when he was scared or in pain. If I hadn't seen the thing wearing his clothes, I might have believed it, might have called out to him. "Please, Brian, something attacked me. I'm bleeding bad. I can't feel my legs." The voice was coming from just beyond the clearing now, and I could see a faint light moving through the trees. But I remembered those yellow eyes, those needle teeth, and I pressed myself deeper into the shadows behind the log. "I know you're there, Brian." The voice had changed now, becoming flat and emotionless. "I can smell your fear. It smells delicious." The light went out and the forest plunged into complete darkness. I closed my eyes and tried to control my breathing, knowing that any sound might give away my position. But in the silence I could hear it moving around the clearing, searching for me. Its footsteps were soft now, deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. Something brushed against the log I was hiding behind, and I felt rather than saw the creature lean over me. Its breath was hot and rancid, carrying the stench of rotting meat and something else, something that smelled like old graves and forgotten nightmares. "Found you," it whispered. I rolled away from the log just as claws raked through the air where my head had been. My dying flashlight showed me the creature in all its horrible glory. 7 feet tall, skeletal thin, with Marcus's face stretched over features that were distinctly inhuman. Its eyes were completely yellow now, with no trace of pupils, and its mouth had elongated into something that could accommodate far too many teeth. I scrambled to my feet and ran again, but this time I had a plan. During our first day of hiking, I'd noticed an old ranger station marked on my map, abandoned but still standing somewhere to the east of our route. If I could find it, I might be able to barricade myself inside until dawn. The creature, I knew now that it was a Wendigo, one of the cannibalistic monsters from Native American folklore that Marcus had always been fascinated by, followed me through the forest, sometimes close enough that I could feel its claws scraping against my backpack, sometimes falling back only to reappear ahead of me, as if it knew these woods better than any living thing should. By some miracle, I found the ranger station just as my flashlight finally died. The building was little more than a one-room cabin with boarded windows and a door that hung askew on rusted hinges, but it was shelter. I threw myself inside and slammed the door behind me, fumbling in the darkness for something to barricade it with. My hands found an old desk, and I wrestled it against the door just as something heavy slammed into the wood from outside. The impact shook the entire building, and I heard the Wendigo's claws scraping against the door as it tried to find a way in. "Let me in, Brian," it said in Marcus's voice. "It's cold out here. I'm so cold." I pressed my back against the desk and tried to think. The boarded windows would keep the creature out for a while, but I knew it was only a matter of time before it found a way inside. And when the sun came up, it would retreat back into the deep forest, taking whatever remained of my friend with it. That's when I remembered the flare gun in my pack. Marcus had insisted I bring it, even though I'd argued that we didn't need it for a simple 3-day hike. "Better safe than sorry," he'd said, and now I wondered if some part of him, the real Marcus, had known what was going to happen. I fumbled through my pack in the darkness until my fingers closed around the flare gun. It only had 2 shots, but if I could hit the Wendigo with one of them, the magnesium burn might be enough to drive it off or even kill it. The scraping at the door had stopped, and the silence was somehow worse than the noise had been. I strained my ears, trying to figure out where the creature had gone, when I heard a new sound that made my heart stop. Scratching. From above. It was on the roof, tearing at the old shingles with its claws. Within minutes, it had opened a hole large enough to squeeze through, and I heard it drop into the cabin with a wet thud. In the absolute darkness, I couldn't see it, but I could hear it breathing, smell its rotten breath, feel the heat radiating from its unnatural body. "Hello, Brian," it said, and this time it didn't bother using Marcus's voice. This voice was like wind through a graveyard, like the last breath of a dying man. "I've been so hungry, and you smell so fresh, so alive." I raised the flare gun, trying to aim by sound alone, and pulled the trigger. The flare exploded in a burst of brilliant red light, illuminating the cabin in stark detail. The Wendigo was directly in front of me, close enough to touch, its yellow eyes reflecting the magnesium fire like twin suns. The flare hit its center mass, and the creature's scream was like nothing I'd ever heard, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. It stumbled backward, its body wreathed in flames, but instead of falling down, it began to laugh. The fire was burning away the remains of Marcus's face, revealing the true horror underneath. A skull covered in patches of rotting flesh, with antlers protruding from its temples like a crown of bone. "Thank you," it said as the flames died down. "I was getting tired of wearing your friend." I fired the second flare, but my hands were shaking so badly that it went wide, embedding itself in the wall behind the creature. The Wendigo lunged forward, and I felt its claws rake across my chest, tearing through my jacket and the flesh beneath. I fell backward over the desk, rolling toward what I hoped was a window. My fingers found the edge of one of the boards, and I pried at it desperately as the Wendigo advanced. The wood was old and rotten, and it gave way just enough for me to squeeze through. I tumbled out into the night and ran again, but this time I knew I was dying. I could feel blood soaking through my shirt, and each breath was a struggle. The Wendigo followed at a leisurely pace now, confident that I couldn't escape. But as I stumbled through the forest, I began to see something that gave me hope. A faint glow on the horizon that meant dawn was coming. Wendigos were creatures of darkness and winter. Maybe, if I could survive until sunrise, it would retreat back to whatever hell had spawned it. I made it to a small ridge just as the first rays of sunlight pierced the canopy. Behind me, the Wendigo let out another of its inhuman screams, but this one was different, filled with pain and frustration rather than hunger. When I turned around, it was gone. I found my way back to civilization 3 days later, more dead than alive. The park rangers who rescued me said I'd been found nearly 30 miles from where Marcus and I had entered the wilderness, in an area that wasn't even supposed to be accessible by foot. They searched for Marcus for 2 weeks, but never found any trace of him. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead due to exposure or animal attack. I never told them what really happened. Who would believe such a story? But sometimes, on cold nights when the wind howls through the trees, I still hear Marcus's voice calling my name. And I know that somewhere in the deep wilderness of the Cabinet Mountains, something that was once my best friend is still hunting, still hungry, still waiting for the next group of hikers to venture too far from the safety of marked trails. I never went camping again. Never will, because I learned something in those mountains that no man should have to learn, that there are things in the darkness that are far worse than death, and some hungers that can never be satisfied. The scars on my chest have healed, but they still ache when winter comes. And every October, when the air turns cold and the leaves begin to fall, I remember the Wendigo of Glacier Gulch, and I wonder if it remembers me too. My name is Brian Wright, and I survived something that shouldn't exist. But survival, I've learned, can be its own kind of curse, because now I know what's waiting out there in the wild places of the world, and I'll never be able to forget the sound of my best friend's voice begging me to let him in, even though I knew he was already dead. The Wendigo is real. Marcus is gone, and somewhere in the Cabinet Mountains of Montana, something ancient and evil is still feeding on the flesh of the innocent. That's my story. That's my warning. Stay on the marked trails. Don't venture into the wilderness alone. And if you ever hear a familiar voice calling to you from the darkness, don't answer, because it might not be who you think it is. And by the time you realize your mistake, it will already be too late. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote backcountry of Glacier National Park, Montana, near the Canadian border where civilization becomes nothing more than a distant memory. The autumn of 2024 was supposed to be our last hurrah before real life consumed us all. 4 friends from college, reuniting for one final adventure before marriages, mortgages, and monotony, claimed our souls. I'd organized the trip to the Belly River area of Glacier National Park, a place so remote that cell towers were theoretical concepts and the nearest ranger station was a 2-day hike through trackless wilderness. There was Sarah Rodriguez, my girlfriend of 3 years, whose infectious laugh could brighten the darkest mood. She'd been struggling with anxiety since her father's sudden death 6 months prior, but this trip was supposed to help her heal. Then there was Kevin King, my college roommate and eternal optimist, who could find the silver lining in a nuclear winter. Finally, there was Jennifer Williams, no relation despite the shared surname, a quiet, introspective photographer who documented everything through her vintage Nikon. She'd been battling insomnia for months, claiming that something about darkness terrified her in ways she couldn't explain. We'd planned to spend 5 days in the backcountry, hiking the obscure Mokawani's Lake Trail that few tourists ever attempted. The park rangers had warned us about early-season snowfall and the increased bear activity as animals prepared for winter, but we were experienced hikers. We thought we were prepared for anything nature could throw at us. We were wrong. The first sign something was amiss came on day 2, as we set up camp near the shores of Mokawanis Lake. The water stretched before us like black glass, reflecting the towering peaks of the Continental Divide. Jennifer was adjusting her camera settings for the golden hour when she suddenly went rigid. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her knuckles white as she gripped her camera. We all stopped what we were doing. The wilderness around us had fallen into an unnatural silence. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals, not even the whisper of wind through the pines. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. "I don't hear anything," Kevin said, but his usual cheerful tone was strained. "That's exactly what I mean," Jennifer replied. "It's too quiet. Something's wrong." Sarah moved closer to me, and I could feel her trembling. "Maybe we should head back tomorrow," she suggested. "I'm getting a really bad feeling about this place." But I was determined to complete our planned route. "We've come too far to turn back now," I said, though something cold was already crawling up my spine. "Let's just get the camp set up and get a fire going. Everything will seem better once we have some light." That was my first mistake. As darkness began to swallow the mountains, our campfire struggled to catch. The wood was dry enough, but every time we thought the flames were taking hold, they would sputter and die. When Kevin finally managed to coax a small blaze to life, the flames flickered an unnatural blue-green color that made all our faces look corpse-pale. "That's weird," Kevin muttered, poking at the fire with a stick. "I've never seen flames that color before." Jennifer had retreated to her tent, claiming she felt sick, but I could hear her moving around restlessly inside. Sarah sat pressed against my side, her eyes darting nervously toward the tree line where shadows seemed to shift and writhe in the firelight. "Michael," she whispered, "I keep feeling like something's watching us." I wanted to dismiss her fears, but I felt it too. A presence just beyond the reach of our meager light, patient and hungry. The feeling was so intense that the hair on my arms stood on end. Around midnight, Jennifer's screaming tore through the darkness. We found her tent empty, the sleeping bag unzipped from the inside. Her camera lay abandoned on the tent floor, still warm to the touch. Kevin grabbed his flashlight and we spread out to search, calling her name into the oppressive darkness. "Jennifer, where are you?" The echo of our voices came back wrong, distorted, as if the mountain itself was mocking us. Sarah was sobbing now, convinced that a bear had taken our friend. But there were no signs of struggle, no blood, no torn fabric. Jennifer had simply vanished. We searched until dawn, our flashlight beams seeming feeble and insignificant against the vast wilderness. When the sun finally crested the peaks, we found Jennifer sitting calmly by the lake shore, staring out across the water. "Jesus Christ, Jennifer!" Kevin shouted as we ran toward her. "We've been looking for you all night. What happened?" She turned to look at us and something in my chest went cold. Jennifer's eyes were different. Not the warm brown I remembered, but a pale, icy blue that seemed to reflect light like an animal's. Her smile was too wide, stretching her lips in a way that looked painful. "I went for a walk," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "The darkness called to me." Sarah grabbed my arm. "Michael, something's wrong with her. Look at her eyes." Jennifer's head tilted at an unnatural angle as she studied Sarah. "Wrong?" she asked, that horrible smile never wavering. "Nothing's wrong. I feel perfect. I feel hungry." Kevin approached her slowly, hands raised in a calming gesture. "Jen, you're scaring us. Did you hit your head? Do you remember what happened?" "I remember everything," Jennifer replied, standing with a fluid grace that seemed somehow inhuman. "I remember the voice in the darkness. I remember the cold hands that touched my face. I remember the taste of—" She stopped abruptly, her head snapping toward the forest behind us. "They're coming," she whispered. "They're so very hungry." That's when we heard it, a sound that seemed to originate from somewhere deep in the earth itself. A low, mournful wailing that rose and fell like a funeral dirge. It was joined by another voice, then another, until the entire forest echoed with an otherworldly chorus of despair. "We need to leave," Sarah said, backing toward our camp. "We need to leave, right now." But as we turned to gather our gear, we found our tents had been torn to shreds. Our backpacks were gone, our supplies scattered and spoiled. The food we'd carefully packed was now a rotting, maggot-infested mess that filled the air with the stench of decay. Jennifer laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You can't leave," she said. "They won't let you. We're all part of the family now." Kevin grabbed what remained of our emergency kit while I tried to think rationally. We could hike out without our gear if we had to. It would be dangerous, but we could make it to the main trail by nightfall if we pushed hard. "Jennifer," I said carefully, "you're coming with us. Whatever happened to you out there, we'll get you help." Her pale eyes fixed on mine, and I saw something ancient and malevolent staring back at me. "I don't need help," she said, "but you will. When the sun goes down, they'll come for you." and you'll understand why I'm so grateful. We tried to take her with us, but she refused to move. When Kevin attempted to physically guide her, she hissed like a wild animal and scratched deep gouges in his arm with fingernails that seemed impossibly long and sharp. "Leave her," Sarah pleaded. "Michael, we have to go. Look at her, that's not Jennifer anymore." I knew she was right, but the thought of abandoning our friend felt like a betrayal. As we backed away from the lake, Jennifer stood motionless by the water's edge, that terrible smile never leaving her face. We hiked for hours through terrain that seemed to shift and change around us. Trails we'd marked on our GPS the day before had vanished, replaced by dense thickets of undergrowth that tore at our clothes and skin. The sun, which should have been our guide, seemed to move in impossible directions, casting shadows that pointed in every direction at once. "This is impossible," Kevin muttered, consulting his compass for the 100th time. "We should have reached the main trail hours ago." Sarah had grown increasingly agitated as the day wore on. She kept looking over her shoulder, convinced we were being followed. And maybe we were. I caught glimpses of pale figures moving between the trees, always just at the edge of my vision, always gone when I turned to look directly. As evening approached, our situation became desperate. We were lost, exhausted, and completely unprepared to spend another night in the wilderness. Worse, the temperature was dropping rapidly, and the thin mountain air carried the promise of snow. "There," Kevin pointed to a cluster of evergreens. "We can shelter there for the night, build a windbreak." We huddled together as darkness fell, using our body heat to ward off the cold. The forest around us came alive with sounds, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, and underneath it all, that horrible wailing we'd heard by the lake. "What do you think happened to Jennifer?" Sarah whispered. I didn't want to voice my fears, but the truth was eating at me like acid. "I think something took her place," I said finally. "Something wearing her face." Kevin tried to maintain his optimism. "She's probably just in shock. Hypothermia can cause confusion, personality changes." His words were cut off by a scream that echoed through the mountains, a sound of pure agony that seemed to go on forever. It was followed by another scream, then another, until the night itself seemed to be screaming. "Oh, God!" Sarah sobbed. "What is that?" Through the trees, we could see lights moving in the darkness. Not the steady beam of flashlights, but a cold, phosphorescent glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. The lights were getting closer. "We have to run," I said, pulling Sarah to her feet. But as we stumbled through the darkness, we quickly realized the horrible truth. We were surrounded. The lights formed a circle around us, slowly contracting like a noose. In the pale glow, we could make out shapes moving between the trees. They looked human from a distance, but their movements were wrong. Too fluid, too graceful, like predators stalking prey. Sarah's grip on my hand was so tight I thought she might break my fingers. Kevin was breathing in short, panicked gasps, his usual confidence completely shattered. Then Jennifer stepped into the circle of light. She was no longer alone. Behind her stood 3 other figures, a man in tattered hiking clothes, a woman in a park ranger uniform, and something that might have once been human, but was now so emaciated and twisted that it barely resembled a person at all. "I told you they were coming," Jennifer said, her voice carrying an otherworldly echo. "They've been waiting so long for fresh meat." The thing that had once been human stepped forward, and I could see that its fingers had been replaced by long, yellowed claws. Its mouth hung open, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth stained with old blood. "Wendigo," Kevin whispered, and I knew he was right. The creature from Native American legend, the cannibal spirit that possessed the desperate and hungry, transforming them into something monstrous. "Please," Sarah begged, tears streaming down her face. "Jennifer, you have to fight this. You're still in there somewhere." For a moment, something flickered in Jennifer's pale eyes, a spark of recognition, of pain. But then the thing controlling her reasserted itself, and that terrible smile returned. "Jennifer is gone," she said. "I am hunger. I am winter. I am the voice that calls in the darkness when all hope is lost." The Wendigo creature let out a howling shriek that seemed to shake the very mountains. The other possessed figures began to close in, their movements becoming more predatory with each step. That's when Kevin did something incredibly brave and incredibly stupid. He charged at Jennifer, tackled her to the ground, yelling for us to run. Sarah and I fled into the darkness, our feet pounding against the frozen ground as inhuman screams echoed behind us. I could hear Kevin fighting, his voice raised in defiance and pain. Then his screams joined the others, and I knew we'd lost him too. We ran blindly through the forest, branches tearing at our faces and clothes. Behind us, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. The padding of feet that no longer needed to worry about stealth, the rustle of movement through the underbrush, and underneath it all, that horrible wailing that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Sarah stumbled and fell, crying out as her ankle twisted beneath her. I hauled her to her feet, but I could see she was badly hurt. "I can't," she gasped. "Michael, I can't run anymore." The sounds of pursuit had stopped. The forest had fallen silent again, but this time the silence was pregnant with menace. They were close. I could feel their presence like ice water in my veins. "This way," I whispered, helping Sarah toward what looked like a depression in the ground. It turned out to be a small cave, barely large enough for 2 people, but it was shelter. We crawled inside and pressed ourselves against the back wall. Sarah was shivering uncontrollably, whether from cold or terror I couldn't tell. Outside, we could hear them searching, the soft sound of footsteps on fallen leaves, the scratch of claws against stone. Then Jennifer's voice, sweet and reasonable, called out to us. "Michael, Sarah, why are you hiding? We just want to talk." Sarah pressed her face against my shoulder to muffle her sobs. I held her tight, trying to project a calm I didn't feel. "We know you're here," Jennifer continued. "We can smell your fear. It's making us so very hungry." A pale hand appeared at the mouth of the cave, fingers unnaturally long and ending in sharp points. The hand was followed by Jennifer's face, but her features had changed. Her cheekbones were sharper, her jaw more pronounced, and when she smiled, I could see that her teeth had become pointed fangs. "Found you," she whispered. But as she reached for us, Sarah did something unexpected. She grabbed a handful of dirt and small stones from the cave floor and threw it directly into Jennifer's face. The creature that had been our friend recoiled with a shriek of rage and pain. "The eyes," Sarah gasped. "Michael, it doesn't like light in its eyes." I understood immediately. While Jennifer, or the thing controlling her, was temporarily blinded, we squeezed out of the cave and ran again. This time, I knew we needed more than just distance. We needed a plan. "The lake," I said as we stumbled through the darkness. "We need to get back to the lake." "Are you insane?" Sarah demanded. "That's where this all started." "The Wendigo legends," I explained breathlessly. "They're creatures of cold and darkness. Fire and running water can ward them off. If we can make it to the lake—" We navigated by sound and intuition, following the faint whisper of flowing water. Several times we heard the creatures calling to each other in the darkness, their voices disturbingly human one moment and bestially inhuman the next. When we finally reached the shore of Mokawanis Lake, the moon had emerged from behind the clouds, casting everything in an eerie silver light. The water lapped gently against the rocky shore, and for a moment I allowed myself to hope we might escape. Then I saw them. They emerged from the tree line like ghosts, Jennifer and the 3 other possessed figures, moving with that same unnatural grace. But now I could see them clearly in the moonlight, and the sight nearly drove me to my knees. Jennifer's transformation was nearly complete. Her skin had taken on a gray, mottled appearance, and her limbs had lengthened until her proportions were grotesquely distorted. The others were even worse. The thing that had once been the park ranger was now so emaciated that its ribs showed through its torn uniform, while the original Wendigo creature was something from mankind's darkest nightmares. "No more running," the Jennifer thing said, its voice a harmony of different tones. "Time to join the family." But as they advanced, I noticed something. They stayed well back from the water's edge, their movements becoming more cautious the closer they got to the lake. "The water," I whispered to Sarah. "They're afraid of the water." Without hesitation, I grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her into the lake. The cold was shocking, so intense it felt like needles piercing every inch of my skin. But the creatures stopped at the shoreline, unwilling or unable to follow us. The Jennifer thing let out a shriek of frustration that echoed across the water. "You cannot stay there forever," it called. "When you come out, we will be waiting. We have nothing but time." Sarah was already turning blue from the cold, her teeth chattering so violently she could barely speak. "Michael," she gasped, "I can't much longer." I knew she was right. The mountain lake was ice cold even in summer, and in late autumn it would kill us in minutes. But as I looked at the shore, I saw something that gave me hope. Our original campfire, the one that had burned with those strange blue flames, was still smoldering. A few coals glowed in the darkness like tiny stars. "I'm going to try something," I told Sarah. "When I say go, you swim for the opposite shore. Don't look back, no matter what you hear." "Michael, no." But I was already moving, swimming toward the shore with powerful strokes. The creatures watched my approach with hungry anticipation, but as I reached the shallows, I grabbed one of the smoldering pieces of wood from our fire. The coal was still hot enough to burn my palm, but I ignored the pain. As the Jennifer thing reached for me with its clawed hands, I thrust the glowing ember directly into its face. The effect was immediate and horrifying. The creature burst into flames that spread across its body like it was made of dry kindling. Its screams filled the night air as it stumbled backward, the fire consuming what remained of Jennifer's human form. The other Wendigo creatures recoiled from the flames, hissing and wailing. But one of them, the original, most transformed one, seemed different. It looked at the burning Jennifer thing with something that might have been sadness, then turned its pale eyes toward me. "You have freed her," it said in a voice like winter wind through dead leaves. "The hunger no longer controls her. For this, gratitude." Then it opened its mouth and let out a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard. Part howl, part lament, part something else entirely. The other possessed figures began to convulse, their bodies twisting and contorting as if fighting against invisible chains. One by one, they collapsed to the ground. When they rose again, their eyes had returned to normal human colors, though they looked confused and terrified. Where are we?" the man in hiking clothes asked, looking around in bewilderment. The woman in the ranger uniform was crying, staring at her hands as if seeing them for the first time in months. "I remember," she whispered. "Oh God, I remember everything. The things I did, the people I—" But the original Wendigo, the source of the infection, remained unchanged. It looked at me with ancient, hungry eyes. "You think this ends the hunger?" it asked. "You think destroying the others frees you from what you've seen? The hunger is eternal. It waits in the cold places, in the dark places, in the desperate places of the human heart." I backed toward the water, still clutching the burning brand. "Maybe," I said, "but it won't have us." The creature laughed, a sound like icicles breaking. "Won't it? Tell me, Michael Williams, what will you do when the nightmares come? When you wake in the dark, remembering the taste of fear? When you look at the woman you love and wonder if the hunger might claim you too?" Before I could respond, it turned and melted back into the forest, leaving only the faint echo of its laughter hanging in the air. The rescued people, victims who had been missing for weeks or months, helped us gather what supplies we could find. The woman, Ranger Patricia Martinez, used her emergency radio to call for a rescue helicopter. As dawn broke over the mountains, we could hear the distant sound of rotors approaching. Sarah and I were treated for severe hypothermia and exposure. The other victims were taken to hospitals for physical and psychological evaluation. In the days that followed, search teams found Kevin's body near where we'd last seen him. The official report listed his death as the result of a bear attack, though the injuries were unlike anything the medical examiners had seen before. Jennifer's body was never found. Where she had burned by the lake shore, nothing remained but a patch of blackened earth where nothing would ever grow again. The authorities accepted our story about getting lost and encountering a dangerous wild animal. Park officials quietly closed the Makawani's Lake area to visitors, citing environmental concerns. The other victims corroborated parts of our account, though none of them could remember clearly what had happened during their possession. But I remembered everything. Sarah and I tried to return to our normal lives, but the creature had been right about the nightmares. Every night, I dreamed of pale figures moving through dark forests, of hunger that could never be satisfied, of Jennifer's face as the flames consumed her. Sarah's anxiety worsened dramatically. She couldn't bear to be alone in the dark, and she jumped at every unexpected sound. We moved in together, partly out of love, but mostly because neither of us could stand being alone with our memories. 6 months later, Sarah disappeared. I came home from work to find the apartment empty, her keys still on the kitchen counter, her purse by the door. The windows were open despite the cold March air, and the curtains moved in the breeze like ghostly fingers. On the refrigerator, held by a magnet shaped like a camera, a gift from Jennifer, was a note in Sarah's handwriting. "The hunger is calling. I have to go to them. I'm sorry. I love you." I called the police, filed a missing person report, organized search parties, but I knew she was gone. The Wendigo had been patient, waiting for the perfect moment to claim what it had been denied at the lake. Sometimes, late at night, my phone rings. When I answer, I hear Sarah's voice, distant and distorted, calling my name. Behind her voice, I can hear others, Jennifer, Kevin, and voices I don't recognize. They're all there, somewhere in the cold and darkness, and they're hungry. They're always hungry. I've moved 3 times since then, but distance doesn't matter. The Wendigo transcends geography, feeding on isolation and despair. It's not just a creature of legend, it's a manifestation of humanity's darkest impulses, the hunger that lives in all of us. I know it's only a matter of time before it comes for me too. The dreams are getting more vivid, more real. Sometimes I wake up to find frost on my bedroom windows, even in summer. Sometimes I catch glimpses of pale figures in my peripheral vision, always gone when I turn to look. And lately, I've been feeling so very hungry. The authorities think I'm having a breakdown, that grief and trauma have driven me to delusion. My therapist talks about survivor's guilt and post-traumatic stress disorder. She doesn't understand that some hungers can't be cured with medication and therapy. I'm writing this account as a warning, though I doubt anyone will believe it. If you're planning to visit the remote areas of Glacier National Park, especially near the Canadian border, please reconsider. The Makawani's Lake area may be officially closed, but that doesn't stop the thing that lives there from hunting. And if you do go into the wilderness, any wilderness, pay attention to the silence. When the forest holds its breath, when the darkness seems to press against you like a living thing, when you hear voices calling your name from places where no one should be, run, run, and don't look back, because the hunger is patient and it's always, always listening. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. In 2 days, I'm driving back to Montana. I can't explain why, but something is calling me home. The hunger is so strong now that I can barely think of anything else. I hope whoever finds this understands what happened to us. I hope they're stronger than we were. But mostly, I hope they never have to find out. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote backcountry of Glacier National Park, Montana, near the abandoned mining settlement of Polebridge, where the forest grows so thick that daylight barely penetrates the canopy even at noon. The trip was supposed to be a celebration. After 2 grueling years of medical school, my best friend David Jones had finally matched into his residency program at Johns Hopkins. Our tight-knit group from college, David, Jennifer Williams, no relation despite the shared surname, and Thomas Davis, had planned this wilderness excursion for months. We'd chosen the most isolated trail we could find, the old Bowman Creek Trail that winds through the northwest corner of Glacier National Park, far from the tourist crowds and cell towers. Jennifer had insisted on bringing her German shepherd, Rex, a massive black and tan beast with intelligent amber eyes who'd been her constant companion since her divorce 2 years prior. "He's better company than most humans," she'd joke, but we all knew Rex was more than a pet to her. He was family. The October air was crisp and clean when we started our hike from the Polebridge Ranger Station at dawn. The ranger on duty, a weathered man named Pete Kowalski, had given us a strange look when we'd mentioned our intended route. "Bowman Creek Trail, eh?" He'd scratched his graying beard thoughtfully. "Haven't had folks go up that way in, must be 3 months now. Last group came back after just one night, said they heard things that didn't sit right with them." Thomas, ever the skeptic, had laughed it off. "What kind of things?" "Bears. We've got bear spray and know how to hang our food." Pete's eyes had grown distant. "Not bears, son. Something else. Been reports of strange sounds up that way. Voices where there shouldn't be any. But you folks look capable enough. Just trust your instincts up there, all right?" We'd assured him we would, and set off into the wilderness, our packs heavy with 5 days' worth of supplies. The trail began easily enough, winding through groves of towering ponderosa pines and Douglas firs. Rex bounded ahead, his tail wagging as he investigated every scent and sound. Jennifer had trained him well. He never strayed far from our group. "God, I'd forgotten how quiet it is out here," David said as we paused for lunch beside a small creek. The only sounds were the gentle babbling of water over stones and the distant call of a Clark's nutcracker. "Quiet's good for the soul," Jennifer replied, scratching Rex behind the ears. "After living in Seattle for 3 years, I forgot what silence actually sounds like." Thomas was studying our topographical map, his brow furrowed in concentration. "According to this, there should be an old mining cabin about 2 miles ahead. Might make a good shelter for tonight if the weather turns." The afternoon passed peacefully as we climbed higher into the Whitefish Range. The trees grew denser here, their branches intertwining overhead to create a natural cathedral of green and brown. Shafts of golden sunlight slanted through gaps in the canopy, illuminating patches of forest floor carpeted with fallen leaves. It was Rex who first sensed something was wrong. Around 4 o'clock, as we crested a small ridge, the dog suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. His ears pricked forward, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. The hair along his spine stood on end. "What is it, boy?" Jennifer asked, immediately alert. Rex's behavior had saved her from a rattlesnake encounter in Arizona 2 summers ago, and she'd learned to trust his instincts implicitly. We all froze, straining our ears for whatever had caught the dog's attention. For a long moment, there was nothing but the usual forest sounds. Then, carried on the wind, came the faintest whisper of sound, almost like human voices, but too distant and distorted to make out words. "Probably just other hikers," David said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. Thomas checked his GPS device and frowned. "That's weird. This thing says we're still on the trail, but..." He looked around at the dense forest surrounding us. "I could swear the trail was clear a few minutes ago." I examined our surroundings more carefully. He was right. The path we'd been following seemed to have narrowed significantly, and the trees pressed closer on either side. Fallen logs and thick undergrowth that I didn't remember seeing before now partially blocked our way. "We must have taken a wrong turn somewhere," Jennifer said, but her voice lacked conviction. Rex remained tense beside her, his amber eyes fixed on something in the forest that only he could see. The whispered voices came again, slightly louder this time. They seemed to drift from multiple directions at once, creating an unsettling echo effect that made it impossible to pinpoint their source. "Hello?" David called out. "Is someone there?" The voices stopped immediately, as if they'd been somehow aware of his call. The forest fell into an unnatural silence. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, Even the wind seemed to have died completely. "This is getting weird," Thomas muttered, shouldering his pack. "Let's find that mining cabin and set up camp. Maybe we'll have better cell reception there and can figure out exactly where we are." We pressed on through the increasingly difficult terrain. The trail, if it could still be called that, wound through dense thickets of mountain ash and serviceberry. Thorns caught at our clothing and pack straps. Several times we had to climb over or crawl under fallen trees that completely blocked our path. Rex's agitation grew worse as the afternoon wore on. He whined constantly now, pressing close to Jennifer's legs as if seeking reassurance. Every few minutes he would stop and stare into the forest, his body rigid with tension. "I've never seen him act like this," Jennifer said, worry evident in her voice. "He's usually fearless." "Animals can sense things we can't," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Probably just picking up scent traces from bears or wolves." But even as I spoke the words, I knew it was more than that. There was something fundamentally wrong about this place, though I couldn't articulate exactly what. The very air seemed oppressive, heavy with an indefinable sense of malevolence. As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, casting long shadows through the forest, we finally spotted the mining cabin. It sat in a small clearing perhaps 50 yards off what remained of the trail, its weathered log walls and corrugated metal roof looking surprisingly intact after decades of abandonment. "Thank God," Thomas breathed. "I was beginning to think we'd be sleeping under the stars tonight." The cabin was larger than I'd expected. A single-room structure with a stone fireplace and 2 small windows flanking the door. Someone had left a neat stack of split logs beside the fireplace, though they looked far too fresh to have been cut by miners from the 1940s. "Somebody's been maintaining this place," David observed as we approached the front door. "Look, the hinges have been oiled recently, and there's no rust on the door handle." Jennifer held Rex's collar as we investigated the cabin's interior. The dog had begun to growl again, his hackles raised as he stared at the structure. "Maybe it's a ranger station," I suggested, though no official signs or markings were visible anywhere. The inside of the cabin was Spartan but clean. A simple wooden table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the room, while built-in bunks lined one wall. Someone had swept the floor recently. No dust or debris cluttered the corners, and the stone fireplace showed evidence of recent use. "This is perfect," Thomas said, dropping his pack on one of the lower bunks. "We can get a fire going, heat up some of that chili Jennifer packed, and figure out our route for tomorrow." But Jennifer remained outside with Rex, who absolutely refused to enter the cabin. The dog planted his feet and pulled backward whenever she tried to coax him through the doorway. "He won't come in," she called to us. "I've never seen him refuse to follow me anywhere before." "Leave him outside then," David suggested. "He'll be fine with his thick coat, and the temperatures aren't supposed to drop below 40 tonight." As darkness fell, we settled into the cabin for the night. I managed to get a fire crackling in the fireplace using the mysteriously fresh wood, while David prepared our dinner. Thomas spread his sleeping bag on one of the upper bunks and began updating his trail journal. Outside, Rex had finally stopped growling, but he remained vigilant, pacing in circles around the cabin. Through the windows, I could see his silhouette moving restlessly in the firelight. The first few hours passed normally enough. We ate our dinner, shared stories from college, and made plans for the remainder of our trip. David regaled us with increasingly ridiculous tales from his clinical rotations, while Thomas showed us photographs he'd taken during our hike. But around 10 o'clock, as we were preparing for sleep, the whispered voices returned. They started so softly that I initially thought I was imagining them, a barely audible murmur that seemed to emanate from the cabin walls themselves. But gradually, they grew louder and more distinct, though the words remained incomprehensible. "Do you guys hear that?" Jennifer asked from her bunk. She'd finally convinced Rex to lie down just outside the door, though the dog remained alert and watchful. "Hear what?" Thomas asked, but even as he spoke, his expression changed. The voices were becoming impossible to ignore. David sat up in his sleeping bag, listening intently. "It sounds like chanting," almost, like some kind of ritual. The voices rose and fell in a rhythmic pattern that was simultaneously hypnotic and deeply unsettling. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the floorboards, drifting down the chimney, seeping through the log walls like water through a sieve. "We should go," Jennifer said suddenly, sitting bolt upright. "Rex was right. There's something wrong with this place." "Go where?" Thomas asked practically. "It's pitch black out there, and we don't even know exactly where we are. At least here we have shelter and a fire. Better than staying in a place that's clearly cursed or haunted or whatever this is," Jennifer shot back. I wanted to agree with her, but Thomas had a point. Stumbling around the Montana wilderness in complete darkness seemed like a recipe for disaster. Bears, mountain lions, steep drops, and dozens of other hazards waited in the forest beyond our fragile circle of firelight. "Let's just try to get some sleep," I suggested. "The voices are probably just echoes from somewhere else. Maybe there's a group of hikers camped nearby who are having some kind of ceremony." But even as I spoke, I knew how hollow the words sounded. We were miles from any established campground, and the voices didn't sound entirely human. There was something off about their cadence and tone, as if they were being produced by vocal cords not quite designed for human speech. David was the first to fall asleep, exhaustion overcoming unease. His breathing deepened and steadied as the fire burned lower. Thomas followed soon after, though he tossed and turned restlessly on his narrow bunk. Jennifer and I remained awake longer, listening to the strange chorus that continued well into the night. Occasionally, Rex would emit a low whine from his position outside the door, but he never barked or showed any sign of genuine alarm. "Maybe they're not threatening," Jennifer whispered to me across the dark cabin. "Maybe they're just there, like an echo from the past or something." I wanted to believe her, but sleep was a long time coming. When I finally drifted off around 2 in the morning, my dreams were filled with shadowy figures moving through the forest, their faces obscured and their intentions unclear. I woke to absolute silence. The fire had burned down to cold ashes, and pale morning light filtered through the dusty windows. For a moment, I felt relief. Whatever had been making those voices during the night had apparently moved on. Then I realized that Rex wasn't barking his usual morning greeting. I sat up quickly, noting that both David and Thomas were still sound asleep in their bunks. Jennifer's sleeping bag was empty. "Jen?" I called softly, not wanting to wake the others. There was no response. I pulled on my boots and jacket and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp and clean, scented with pine and the faint smokiness of our dying campfire. Birds chirped in the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a squirrel chattered angrily at some perceived threat. But there was no sign of Jennifer or Rex. "Jennifer," I called louder, my voice echoing through the trees. "Rex!" Still no response. I circled the cabin, looking for tracks or any sign of where they might have gone. The ground was soft with fallen leaves and damp earth, but I couldn't make out any clear footprints or paw prints. Back inside the cabin, David and Thomas were beginning to stir. "Where's Jen?" David asked, noticing her empty bunk. "I don't know," I admitted. "She and Rex are both gone. I can't find any tracks." That got both of them fully awake. Within minutes, we'd gathered our gear and begun a systematic search of the area around the cabin. We called Jennifer's name and whistled for Rex, but the forest seemed to swallow our voices without returning even an echo. "This doesn't make sense," Thomas said, consulting his GPS device. "If she went for a walk, she wouldn't have gone far without telling us. And Rex would never leave her side." David was examining the ground near the cabin door with the intensity of a detective. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a section of disturbed earth. "These might be footprints, but they're strange." I knelt beside him to examine the marks he'd found. They were definitely footprints, human-shaped indentations in the soft soil. But they were wrong, somehow. Too deep for someone of Jennifer's slight build, and the spacing between them suggested an unnaturally long stride. "Maybe she was running," I suggested, though the explanation felt weak even to me. Running from what? Thomas asked grimly. We expanded our search, following what might have been a trail of disturbed vegetation leading away from the cabin and deeper into the forest. The undergrowth grew thicker as we progressed, forcing us to push through tangles of thorny bushes and climb over fallen logs. After an hour of searching, we found Rex. The German Shepherd lay motionless beside a large boulder about half a mile from the cabin. For a terrifying moment, I thought he was dead, but as we approached, his flanks rose and fell with slow, steady breathing. "Rex," I called, rushing to the dog's side. "Boy, are you okay?" The shepherd's amber eyes opened, but they seemed unfocused and distant. He didn't respond to his name or react to our presence in any way, just stared blankly at something we couldn't see. David knelt beside the animal and began checking for injuries. "No obvious trauma," he reported, "but something's definitely wrong with him. It's like he's been drugged or something." "Where's Jennifer?" Thomas asked, as if the dog could answer. Rex remained unresponsive, his breathing shallow but steady. Whatever had happened to him, it had left him in some kind of catatonic state. "We need to get him back to the cabin," I said, "and then we need to call for help." But when Thomas checked his cell phone, he found no signal. His GPS device, which had worked perfectly the day before, showed only static. Even his compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. "That's impossible," he muttered, tapping the compass face. "These are mechanical instruments. They don't just stop working." David hefted Rex into his arms. The dog offered no resistance, remaining as limp and passive as a stuffed animal, and we made our way back to the cabin. The return journey felt longer than it should have, as if the forest itself had somehow expanded during our absence. Back at the cabin, we laid Rex on Jennifer's sleeping bag and tried to make sense of our situation. Our friend had vanished without a trace. Her dog had been reduced to a catatonic state, and all our navigation equipment had mysteriously failed. "We need to hike out and get help," David said. "The ranger station can't be more than a day's walk from here." But when we tried to retrace our route from the previous day, we discovered that the trail had changed. Paths that had been clearly defined now dead-ended in impenetrable thickets. Landmarks, we remembered, a distinctive dead tree, a small stream, a rocky outcropping, were nowhere to be found. "This is impossible," Thomas said for the third time that morning. "Terrain doesn't just rearrange itself overnight." We spent the entire day trying to find our way out of the forest, but every path seemed to lead us in circles. By evening, we were back at the cabin, exhausted and demoralized. Rex remained in his catatonic state, though he occasionally twitched as if responding to stimuli only he could perceive. As darkness fell, the whispered voices returned. This time, they seemed closer and more insistent. The rhythmic chanting that had echoed through the cabin walls the night before now surrounded us completely, rising from the forest on all sides. "We're trapped," David said quietly. "Whatever's out there, it doesn't want us to leave." But as the hours passed, something even worse became apparent. The voices weren't just random chanting, they were calling our names. "Michael," came a whispered voice that sounded disturbingly like Jennifer. "Michael, where are you?" "David," called another voice. "Thomas, help me. Please help me." The voices were perfect mimicries of Jennifer's speech patterns and vocal inflections, but there was something subtly wrong with them. They carried an undertone of mockery, as if whatever was producing them found our distress amusing. "Don't listen," I told the others. "It's not her. It can't be her." But the voices continued throughout the night, growing more sophisticated and manipulative. They pleaded, cajoled, and commanded by turns. They spoke of being lost and frightened, of needing our help, of terrible things lurking in the darkness. "I'm hurt," Jennifer's voice whispered from just outside the cabin walls. "I'm bleeding. Please, you have to help me." Thomas actually stood up and moved toward the door before David grabbed his arm. "It's not her," David hissed. "Look at Rex. If Jennifer was really out there, he'd be going crazy trying to get to her. The German shepherd remained motionless on his sleeping bag, his eyes staring at nothing. Morning brought a brief respite from the voices, but our situation had grown even more dire. Our food supplies were running low, and attempts to filter water from a nearby stream had failed. The liquid had an oily, iridescent quality that made it clearly unfit for consumption. More disturbing still, the forest around the cabin continued to change. Trees that had stood in specific positions the day before were now in different locations. New paths appeared overnight, only to vanish again by morning. The very landscape seemed to be shifting and reforming according to some alien logic. On the third day, we found Jennifer. She was sitting on a fallen log about 100 yards from the cabin, her back to us as we approached. Her long brown hair hung in tangles around her shoulders, and her hiking clothes were torn and dirty. "Jen!" David called out as we rushed toward her. "Thank God you're okay." But as we got closer, something about her posture struck me as wrong. She sat too still, too straight, like a mannequin posed in a store window. "Jennifer?" I called more cautiously. Slowly, she turned to face us. Her features were exactly as I remembered them. The heart-shaped face, the green eyes, the small scar on her chin from a childhood accident. But her expression was completely blank, devoid of any emotion or recognition. "Hello, Michael," she said in a voice that was perfectly Jennifer's yet somehow not Jennifer's at all. "Hello, David. Hello, Thomas." "Where have you been?" Thomas demanded. "We've been looking for you for 3 days." Jennifer's head tilted slightly like a bird considering an interesting insect. 3 days, she repeated. "Yes, 3 days." David approached her cautiously. "Are you hurt? You look different." "Different," Jennifer agreed. "Yes, I am different now." She stood up with fluid, unnatural grace, too smooth, too controlled, like a marionette operated by a master puppeteer. Every movement was precise and deliberate, lacking the small imperfections and hesitations that characterized normal human motion. "We need to leave this place," I said, watching her carefully. "All of us. Together." Jennifer's lips curved into a smile that contained no warmth or genuine emotion. "Leave," she said. "Yes, we should leave." But she made no move to go anywhere. Instead, she continued to stand motionless on the forest path, that empty smile fixed on her face. "Jennifer, what happened to you?" David asked gently. "Where have you been?" "I have been learning," she replied. "Learning about you, about all of you. Michael, who failed his father's expectations and turned to medicine to prove his worth. David, who pretends confidence while drowning in imposter syndrome. Thomas, who uses logic and facts to avoid confronting his deep-seated fear of abandonment." The words hit each of us like physical blows. These were insights that Jennifer couldn't possibly have possessed, private fears and insecurities we'd never shared with anyone. "How do you know that?" Thomas whispered. Jennifer's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too white and too sharp. "I know many things now. I know about the old hunger that sleeps beneath these mountains. I know about the voices that call from the spaces between reality. I know about the choice you must make." "What choice?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Join us willingly," Jennifer said, "or be taken against your will. The hunger grows stronger with each passing day. It needs feeding, fresh minds, fresh souls." As she spoke, I became aware of movement in the forest around us. Dark shapes flickered between the trees, human-like figures that moved with the same unnatural grace as the thing wearing Jennifer's face. "Those voices we've been hearing," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They weren't random. They were people who came here and never left." "Very good, David," Jennifer praised mockingly, "though your understanding comes too late to save you." Rex chose that moment to return to consciousness. The German shepherd lifted his head, saw the Jennifer thing, and exploded into the most terrifying display of canine fury I'd ever witnessed. He lunged forward with a snarl that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. The thing wearing Jennifer's face moved faster than anything human could move, sidestepping the attack with impossible speed. But Rex's charge had created the opening we needed. "Run!" I shouted. We sprinted back toward the cabin, Rex close behind us. The thing that had been Jennifer didn't pursue us immediately. It simply stood where we'd left it, watching our retreat with that same empty smile. Back at the cabin, we barricaded the door with the wooden table and chairs. Rex positioned himself in front of the makeshift barrier, his hackles raised and his lips pulled back in a continuous snarl. "That's not Jennifer," Thomas stated the obvious. "Then what is it?" David asked. "And what happened to the real Jennifer?" I thought about the creature's words, about the hunger beneath the mountains and the voices calling from between realities. "I think Jennifer's gone," I said quietly. "I think whatever's out there took her and is now wearing her like a mask." As if summoned by my words, Jennifer's voice called from outside the cabin. But now there were multiple versions of it, speaking in unison from different directions. "Michael," they called. "David. Thomas. Why do you hide from me? I'm your friend." "Don't listen," I warned the others. "It's trying to manipulate us." But the voices were relentless. They spoke of shared memories, of college adventures and inside jokes. They reminded us of Jennifer's kindness, her loyalty, her unwavering friendship. They painted vivid pictures of her suffering, of terrible things being done to her while we cowered in safety. "She saved your life that night you tried to drive home drunk, David," the voices reminded him. "Doesn't she deserve your help now?" David's resolve began to waver. I could see it in his face. The guilt, the desperate need to believe that our friend was still alive and could be rescued. "It's not her," I said firmly. "Jennifer is gone. Whatever's out there is using her form to try to get to us." The psychological assault continued throughout the night. The Jennifer things shared increasingly personal and intimate details about our lives, weaving them into complex emotional manipulations designed to break down our resistance. By morning, Thomas had nearly succumbed to their influence. He sat by the barricaded door, tears streaming down his face as he listened to the voices describing Jennifer's supposed torment. "We have to help her," he whispered. "We can't just leave her out there." "That's not her," I shouted, grabbing him by the shoulders. "Look at Rex. He knows it's not Jennifer." The German shepherd had never stopped growling, never relaxed his defensive posture. His animal instincts recognized the truth that our human emotions struggled to accept. On the fourth day, our situation became critical. Our water had run out, and the voices had begun to affect our sanity in more profound ways. David reported seeing Jennifer through the windows, bloodied and begging for help. Thomas claimed he could hear her crying in the walls of the cabin itself. I was beginning to see things too, shadows that moved when they shouldn't, faces in the grain of the wooden walls, and worst of all, brief glimpses of the real Jennifer's terrified face superimposed over the features of the creature that had taken her form. "We can't stay here," I announced. "We're going to die of thirst if we don't find water soon." "But if we go out there," David began. "We die anyway," I finished. "At least this way we have a chance." Rex seemed to understand our predicament. The loyal dog had accepted us as his pack in Jennifer's absence, and his protective instincts extended to keeping us safe from the creatures outside. I formulated a desperate plan. Rex would lead us through the forest, using his superior senses to detect and avoid the creatures lurking in the trees. We would travel fast and light, abandoning most of our gear in favor of speed and mobility. "What about Jennifer?" Thomas asked as we prepared to leave. "If she's still alive in there somewhere," I said, "then getting help is the only way to save her. And if she's gone—" I couldn't finish the sentence. We removed the barricade and stepped into the morning light. Rex immediately took point, his nose working constantly as he tested the air for signs of danger. The forest was eerily quiet. No bird calls, no insect sounds. Even the wind seemed to have died completely. The German shepherd led us along a route I would never have chosen, a winding path that seemed to double back on itself repeatedly. but I trusted his instincts more than my own navigation skills at this point. For the first hour, we encountered nothing. The forest remained empty and silent, though I could feel unseen eyes watching our progress. Rex's constant vigilance and low growls confirmed that we were not alone. Then we heard Jennifer's voice calling from behind us. "Wait," she cried. "Please don't leave me." The voice was closer than it had been before, and it carried a note of genuine desperation that made it almost impossible to ignore. Thomas actually stopped and turned around before I grabbed his arm and forced him to keep moving. "Michael, help me," Jennifer's voice pleaded. "I'm hurt. I'm bleeding." Rex's response was to increase his pace, practically dragging us along the forest path. Whatever was following us was getting closer. The pursuit continued for hours. Multiple voices now called our names, creating a surround sound effect of pleading, threatening, and cajoling. They promised safety, threatened violence, and described in vivid detail the torments awaiting us if we didn't surrender. But worse than the voices were the glimpses we caught of movement in our peripheral vision. Dark shapes flitted between the trees, keeping pace with our desperate flight. They moved wrong, too fast, too fluid, like oil flowing uphill. "Don't look at them," I warned the others. "Focus on Rex. Follow the dog." As the afternoon wore on, the creatures grew bolder. They began to show themselves more clearly, and what I saw made my stomach churn with primal terror. They were human-shaped but fundamentally wrong in ways my mind struggled to process. Their limbs were too long, their joints bent at impossible angles, and their faces were all Jennifer's. A dozen versions of our friend surrounded us as we fled through the forest, each one slightly different but recognizably her. Some were clean and uninjured, speaking in normal tones. Others were bloodied and broken, their voices distorted by apparent injuries. All of them smiled with that same empty, predatory expression. "Which one is real?" David gasped as we ran. "None of them," I replied. "They're all masks, all lies." Rex suddenly veered sharply to the left, leading us down a steep slope covered with loose rocks and fallen trees. I could hear the creatures behind us, no longer bothering to hide their unnatural movements. They chittered and hissed like insects, their Jennifer faces twisting into expressions of rage at our continued escape. We reached the bottom of the slope and found ourselves beside a small stream, the first fresh water we'd seen in days. Rex immediately began drinking, and we followed his example, desperately gulping the cold, clear liquid. "Look," Thomas pointed upstream. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, was the distinctive shape of a fire tower. Civilization, safety, hope. We ran toward it with renewed energy, Rex bounding ahead as if he too understood that salvation lay within reach. Behind us, the creature's cries grew more frantic and angry, but they seemed reluctant to follow us into the more open terrain around the tower. The fire tower was manned by a Forest Service employee named Jack Morrison, a grizzled man in his 60s who took one look at our haggard appearance and immediately called for a rescue helicopter. "You folks look like you've been through hell," he said, wrapping us in emergency blankets. "How long you been lost out there?" "4 days," I said. "We had a friend with us, Jennifer Williams. She's still out there. We have to go back for her." Jack's expression grew troubled. "Williams, you said? Young woman, brown hair, about 25? "Yes," David said eagerly. "You've seen her." "Son," Jack said gently. "We found a body 3 days ago, about 10 miles from here, in a ravine near Bowman Creek. Brown hair, identification said Jennifer Williams. We've been trying to figure out how to contact next of kin." The words hit us like a physical blow. Jennifer had been dead for 3 days, killed on the very first night of our camping trip. Everything that had happened since then, all the conversations and pleas and manipulations, had been orchestrated by something wearing the face of our dead friend. Rex whined softly and pressed against my legs, seeking comfort. The loyal dog had known the truth all along. The helicopter arrived an hour later, airlifting us to the nearest hospital for medical evaluation. Physically, we were dehydrated and exhausted, but otherwise unharmed. Psychologically, the damage would take much longer to heal. The official investigation concluded that Jennifer had fallen into a hidden ravine while searching for firewood on our first night. The remote location and heavy forest canopy had prevented us from hearing her cries for help. The rest of our experience, the voices, the changing terrain, the creatures wearing Jennifer's face, was attributed to stress, dehydration, and grief-induced hallucinations. I wanted to believe that explanation. It would have been so much easier to accept that we'd simply suffered a series of misadventures and psychological breakdowns. But Rex knew better. The German Shepherd, who had been Jennifer's constant companion for 3 years, refused to go near her body when we held the funeral service. He cowered and whined whenever her name was mentioned, and he never stopped checking over his shoulder as if expecting to see something that shouldn't be there. Dogs don't have hallucinations. Dogs don't succumb to grief-induced psychosis. Dogs know when something is wearing the wrong face. I adopted Rex after the funeral. Jennifer had no family, and it seemed like the right thing to do. But the dog remained forever changed by our experience in the Montana wilderness. He would never again venture into dense forest, and he maintained an almost supernatural vigilance that suggested he was watching for threats that existed beyond normal human perception. Sometimes, late at night, I would catch him staring at the shadows in the corner of my apartment, his amber eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. His body would tense with the same alertness he'd shown during those terrible days in the forest, and a low growl would rumble in his chest. During those moments, I would remember Jennifer's empty smile and her promise that the hunger grows stronger with each passing day. I would remember that there are things in the wilderness that hunger for more than flesh and blood, ancient entities that feed on human consciousness itself, wearing the faces of our loved ones as they whisper seductive lies from the darkness between realities. And I would remember that some places should never be visited, no matter how beautiful or remote they might appear on a map. The Bowman Creek Trail was officially closed 6 months after our rescue. The Forest Service cited unstable terrain and potential rockfall hazards as the reason, but Jack Morrison told me the truth during a phone call that winter. 3 more groups went missing up there, he said quietly. All experienced hikers, all vanished without a trace. We found some remains, but, well, let's just say the condition of the bodies raised questions that don't have comfortable answers. He paused, and I could hear him taking a long drag on a cigarette. You folks were lucky, he continued. Whatever's up there in those mountains, it usually doesn't let people leave. The fact that you made it out at all suggests it might have been toying with you, seeing how far it could push before you broke completely. The thought that our escape had been permitted rather than achieved sent chills down my spine. It suggested that the entities inhabiting that remote wilderness operated according to rules and motivations beyond human understanding. I never returned to Montana. David and Thomas both transferred to medical schools on the East Coast, and we rarely spoke about our experience. The official explanation provided a comforting fiction that allowed us to function in normal society, but we all knew the truth. Some hungers can never be satisfied. Some masks are worn too well to ever be removed, and some voices, once heard, will whisper your name forever from the spaces between dreams and waking, calling you back to feed the ancient darkness that sleeps beneath the mountains. Rex lived for 8 more years, a faithful companion who never quite lost the wariness he'd gained in those Montana woods. When he finally passed away, his last act was to position himself between me and the bedroom door, as if protecting me from something only he could see. I buried him with Jennifer's collar, the one small memento I'd kept from our doomed camping trip. It seemed appropriate somehow. 2 loyal souls reunited in whatever realm exists beyond our perception. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees outside my window, I swear I can hear familiar voices calling my name. They speak of friendship and shared memories, of adventures yet to be had in the wilderness places where reality grows thin and ancient hungers stir in the darkness, They promise that the mountains remember everyone who enters their domain, and they're very, very patient.